Close your eyes for just a moment. Imagine a world so ancient, so profoundly different from anything you have ever seen or touched or breathed that your mind struggles to hold the image. Imagine a single landmass, one enormous, unbroken continent stretching from the frozen south to the frozen north, surrounded by a single vast ocean whose waves have never touched a shoreline you would recognize. Imagine skies filled with air that carries different ratios of gases, clouds that form and break and reform over landscapes that have never been mapped, never been named, never been crossed by anything that walks on two legs and wonders about the stars. Imagine that you're standing at the edge of that world, 250 million years before this moment, and that everything you are about to witness is real. This is not a story about dinosaurs. This is not a story about the creatures that most people picture when they think of prehistoric Earth. This is a story about something older, something stranger, and in many ways something far more significant. This is the story of the Late Permian period, a chapter of life on this planet so rich, so complex, so beautifully organized, and ultimately so catastrophically destroyed that understanding it changes the way we see everything that came after. This is the story of a world that reached a kind of perfection, a delicate and magnificent equilibrium built over millions of years of evolutionary negotiation, and then watched that perfection come apart at the seams in what would become the single greatest biological catastrophe in the history of life on Earth. We are going back. We are going all the way back to the beginning of what we might dare to call the last great age before everything changed. And what we find there is not darkness, not emptiness, not the cold silence of a world still waiting to begin. What we find is a world that was already ancient by its own standards, a world full of living things shaped by hundreds of millions of years of trial and refinement, a world with predators and prey, with forests and deserts, with shallow coastal waters teeming with life and deep ocean trenches sheltering creatures of extraordinary complexity. A world that did not know it was living on borrowed time. Pull up a seat, turn down the lights, because what you're about to hear is one of the greatest stories this planet has ever told, and it begins with the ground itself. To understand the late Permian world, you have to understand something that most of us never really think about, and that is the way the ground beneath our feet is not fixed. It has never been fixed. The solid earth that we walk on, the bedrock that we build cities on, the ocean floors that we map with sonar, none of it sits still. It moves, slowly, almost imperceptibly by the standards of a human lifetime, but relentlessly over geological time. The great plates of the Earth's crust drift across the surface of the planet, carrying the continents with them like passengers on a journey that has no final destination. 250 million years ago, that journey had arrived at one of its most dramatic waypoints. The continents of the Earth had, over an immense span of geological time, converged. They had closed the ancient oceans between them. They had collided along fault lines that pushed up mountain ranges of staggering height. And the result of all of that slow, grinding, titanic convergence was a single landmass, a supercontinent that geologists today call Pangea. The name comes from the ancient Greek, and it means, essentially, all the earth. And in a very real sense, that is exactly what it was. Pangea was everything. It was all of the land that existed on this planet gathered into one place, one body, one continuous stretch of rock and soil and elevation that ran from the southern polar regions all the way to the northern polar regions without a single ocean to interrupt it. If you had been a creature with the ability to walk, and many creatures in the late Permian did have that ability, you could, in theory, have walked from what would one day become the southernmost tip of the southern continents all the way to what would one day become the northernmost edges of the northern landmasses without ever needing to cross deep water. The entire terrestrial world was connected. Now, try to imagine what that means in practical terms for the living world. Try to imagine what it means for climate, what it means for wind, what it means for rain, what it means for the creatures trying to survive in its interior. The answer is this: it was extreme. Everything about Pangea was extreme. When you have a single landmass of that scale, surrounded by a single vast ocean, a body of water that scientists call Panthalassa, meaning all the sea, the interior of the continent is cut off from the moderating influence of ocean water in ways that we simply do not experience on our fragmented, ocean-divided modern Earth. Today, even the deepest interiors of our continents have some relationship with ocean-driven weather systems. Moisture evaporated from the ocean is carried inland by prevailing winds. Rain falls, rivers form, ecosystems develop in response to that moisture. In Pangea, the interior was simply too vast, too deep, too far from any coastline for those moderating influences to reach. The result was a continental interior of breathtaking harshness. Summers in the deep interior of Pangea were not merely warm, they were scorching. Temperatures that no modern desert experiences regularly were routine in the heart of the supercontinent. And winters, without the heat reservoir of a nearby ocean to keep things from dropping too far, were correspondingly brutal. But here is the thing that makes the late Permian climate story even more remarkable. This was not simply a story of harshness. It was a story of rhythm, of cycle, of a world that had learned over millions of years to breathe in a particular pattern. The extreme seasonality of Pangea, the wild swings between the heat of its interior summers and the cold of its interior winters, created a driving pulse that organized life in profound and sophisticated ways. The winds that swept across Pangea were driven partly by this thermal differential between the supercontinent's interior and its coasts. And those winds, those enormous seasonal reversals of airflow, shaped where rain fell and where it did not. Along certain coastal margins, moisture from Panthalassa was driven inland by seasonal winds, creating lush zones of growth. Along other margins, the winds drove away from the ocean, pulling moisture out of the air and leaving behind dry, arid landscapes that tested the limits of biological endurance. And then there was the matter of geography itself, the shape of Pangea, its mountain ranges, its lowlands, its vast internal basins. The collision of ancient continental plates that had assembled Pangea had pushed up enormous mountain chains along some of its internal sutures. These ranges intercepted moisture-laden air and wrung it out on their windward slopes while leaving their leeward sides in rain shadows of extraordinary aridity. The terrain of Pangea was not flat, it was not featureless. It was a landscape of dramatic contrasts, crumpled and folded and elevated and depressed by the forces of plate tectonics, and those contrasts created a patchwork of ecological zones that, taken together, gave life an extraordinary variety of stages on which to perform. Across the vast interior deserts, reddish soils baked under a sun that rose high and hot without the softening filter of significant cloud cover. Sand and rock and dust extended to every horizon. These were not lifeless places. Life, as we will see, had found ways into even the harshest corners of Pangea, but they were places where survival demanded extraordinary specialization. Every drop of water mattered. Every calorie burned in movement had to be justified by the energy gained from food. The creatures that lived in these places were not merely surviving. They were masterworks of biological engineering, shaped by millions of years of selection for efficiency, for water conservation, for the ability to endure conditions that would have been lethal to less specialized forms. Along the margins of Pangea, where the great ocean lapped against the coasts, things were different. Here, moisture was plentiful. The air off Panthalassa carried water vapor that condensed into rain, sometimes in dramatic quantities. Forests grew in these coastal regions, not the kinds of forests we see today, dominated by flowering plants and broad-leaved trees, because flowering plants had not yet evolved, but forests nonetheless, complex, layered, productive assemblages of vegetation dominated by plants whose names sound strange to modern ears. Seed ferns, tree ferns, Lycopsids, cordatelians, and early conifers whose ancestors had been among the first truly terrestrial plants to conquer the ancient land. These coastal forests were the engine rooms of Pangea's terrestrial ecosystems. They fixed atmospheric carbon into organic matter through photosynthesis. They provided food and shelter and structure for an enormous community of dependent organisms. Their root systems held soil in place and drove the weathering of rocks that released nutrients into the system. When they dropped their leaves or their fronds or their reproductive structures, they contributed organic matter to soils that fed the decomposers, the fungi, the invertebrates, whose work in turn released nutrients back into the system for plant growth. It was a cycle as elegant and self-sustaining as anything life has ever invented, and it had been running, with gradual modifications, for an enormous span of time. But between the lush coastal forests and the baking interior deserts, there was a third world, perhaps the most ecologically interesting world of all. A world of transition, of semi-arid plains, of river floodplains, of seasonal wetlands that filled with water in the wet season and cracked and dried in the dry season, of upland scrublands where drought-adapted vegetation eked out an existence on thin soils and limited moisture. This was the world where the drama of the Late Permian played out most intensely. This was where the great vertebrate animals, the synapsids, the reptiles, the amphibians, the early archosaurs made their living. This was where the food webs were most complex, the predator-prey relationships most dynamic, and the evolutionary pressures most intense. The seasons drove everything. Not the gentle, four-season rhythm of much of the modern world, but something more emphatic and uncompromising. In the seasonal zones of Pangea, the wet season came like a gift and the dry season came like a sentence. When the rains arrived, driven by the seasonal reversal of winds that brought moisture in from the ocean, the landscape transformed with extraordinary speed. Plants that had been dormant or stressed sprang back to life. Rivers that had dwindled to trickles became torrents. Water holes that had become cracked mud flats filled and overflowed. The animals responded. They moved, they fed, they reproduced. Life expressed itself with an intensity matched only by the abundance of resources suddenly made available. And then the rains stopped, the winds reversed, the moisture retreated, and the long dry season descended like a closing hand. Rivers fell, water holes shrank, the vegetation dried and became coarse and difficult to process. Animals that had eaten well and grown fat during the wet season now faced weeks or months of scarcity, of searching, of making do with less. Some moved to find better conditions. Some retreated to the margins of rivers and lakes where water and food persisted longest. Some entered physiological states of reduced activity that conserved energy and water through the worst of the drought. It was this rhythm, this annual pulse of abundance and scarcity, of growth and dormancy, of feast and famine, that organized the entire terrestrial biosphere of the Late Permian. Every animal, every plant, every microorganism in Pangea's ecosystems had been shaped by that rhythm, had evolved its life history, its behavior, its physiology in response to it. The rhythm was not a problem to be solved. It was the fundamental fact of existence, and life had not merely accommodated it, but had woven it into its very being. This was the world as it had been for millions of years before the Late Permian reached its peak. This was the baseline, the foundation, the established order against which everything else must be understood. And it was against this backdrop, this vast, strange, rhythmic, extreme, and yet beautifully organized world that the great actors of our story made their entrance. Before we meet the animals, we need to spend a moment with deep time. Because one of the hardest things about understanding the Permian world is getting your head around just how much time had already passed by the time our story begins. The Permian period itself lasted for roughly 47 million years, from approximately 299 million years ago to approximately 252 million years ago. That span of time is already so vast that it resists easy comprehension. But the Permian did not begin in a vacuum. By the time the Permian opened, life on land had already been experimenting and evolving for over 100 million years. The first vertebrates to colonize land had made that transition during the Devonian period, well over 350 million years ago. By the Permian, the conquest of land by vertebrate life was not a recent achievement. It was an ancient and established fact. The Carboniferous period that preceded the Permian, sometimes called the Age of Coal Forests, had been a time of lush, oxygen-rich tropical swamp forests that covered much of the tropical and subtropical zones of the pre-Pangea world. These forests had been home to enormous insects, to the first great radiations of amniotes, animals whose eggs no longer required submersion in water to survive, and to the first stirrings of the evolutionary lineages that would dominate the Permian. The transition from Carboniferous to Permian had not been abrupt. It had been a gradual shift driven partly by the assembly of Pangea itself and the climatic changes that accompanied it. As the continents merged and the vast tropical forests of the Carboniferous shrank and fragmented, the world had become drier, more seasonal, more challenging. And out of that challenge, out of that tightening of conditions, had come a kind of creative pressure that drove evolution in remarkable directions. By the time the Permian was well established, and certainly by the time we reached the Late Permian, the final chapters of this period, roughly 255 to 252 million years ago, the world was populated by animals that represented the product of hundreds of millions of years of vertebrate evolution. These were not primitive, fumbling, barely functional organisms. These were sophisticated, well-adapted, ecologically complex creatures whose lineages had been refining their designs for longer than the mind can easily grasp. And among all of these creatures, one group stood supreme. One lineage had seized the opportunities that the Permian world offered and run with them so completely, so thoroughly, so successfully that they defined the character of the age in the way that a dominant actor defines the character of a production. These were the Synapsids. And their story is the story of the Permian in ways that cannot be overstated. The Synapsids are not a group most people have heard of. They do not have the popular fame of dinosaurs. They do not star in movies or inspire the imagination of children in the same visceral way. But here is a fact that might change your perspective on them. You are a Synapsid. Every human being alive today is, in the technical biological sense, a Synapsid. We are the distant descendants of this group, the latest expression of a lineage that was already ancient and dominant when the first dinosaurs were still millions of years in the future. The Synapsids are our family. They are the branch of the vertebrate family tree to which all mammals belong, including us. The defining feature of a synapsid is an opening in the skull behind the eye socket, a temporal fenestra, as anatomists call it. This might sound like a trivially technical detail, but it is actually a window into something profound, because this opening was the physical space through which the jaw muscles of synapsids passed and attached, and the size and shape of that opening determined the power and the mechanical advantage of the jaw. The evolution of the synapsid skull was, in a very real sense, the evolution of a feeding apparatus of increasing sophistication, and the history of the synapsids is in large part the history of jaw muscles becoming larger, more complex, more capable of generating force and precision in the act of acquiring and processing food. But the skull opening is only the most convenient marker of a group that was distinguished by a whole suite of evolving characteristics. And to understand the late Permian world, we need to appreciate just how far that suite of characteristics had come by the time our story reaches its peak. The earliest synapsids, which had appeared back in the Carboniferous period, were creatures that we might look at today and call somewhat reptile-like, though that label is imprecise in important ways. They were low-slung, with their legs splayed out to the sides rather than positioned directly under their bodies. Their metabolic rates were likely low, in the manner of modern reptiles, meaning they relied heavily on external heat sources to warm their bodies and were limited in their activity levels by ambient temperature. Their teeth were relatively undifferentiated, simple, peg-like structures that did not distinguish much between the different functions of catching, killing, and processing prey. These early synapsids had been successful in their own right. They had diversified extensively during the Carboniferous and early Permian, spreading across the world and filling a variety of ecological roles. But they were, by the standards of what came later, something of a starting point rather than a finished product. And the Permian was the time when the refinement of the synapsid design accelerated dramatically, pushed by the competitive pressures of a complex and demanding world. By the Middle Permian, a major evolutionary transition was already underway within the synapsids. The old groups, a diverse assemblage known broadly as pelycosaurs, though that term is now somewhat outdated in technical circles, were giving way to a new and more sophisticated assemblage called the Therapsids, and it is the Therapsids that dominated the Late Permian in such spectacular fashion. The Therapsids were synapsids in the process of becoming more like the mammals that would eventually descend from them, though they were not yet mammals themselves. They were evolving toward a body plan that was more upright, more energetically active, and more capable of sustaining that activity independent of external temperatures. They were evolving toward better differentiated teeth that were beginning to show the division into incisors, canines, and cheek teeth that is so characteristic of modern mammals. They were evolving toward a more sophisticated relationship with food, with movement, with the environment, and they were wildly successful. By the Late Permian, Therapsid synapsids were the dominant large-bodied vertebrates on land, and they had diversified into an ecological array that covered virtually every major role available in the terrestrial ecosystem. There were large, powerful predators. There were diverse and abundant herbivores of many different body sizes and feeding strategies. There were small, perhaps somewhat insectivorous forms filling niches at the base of the food web. There were semi-aquatic forms that exploited the interface between land and water. The Therapsids were everywhere, and they were in charge. Understanding this dominance, understanding why the Therapsids had achieved it, and what it meant for the organization of the Late Permian world, requires us to look closely at some of the specific innovations that set them apart. The first and perhaps most consequential of these innovations was the trend toward more upright posture. In the early synapsids, and indeed in most vertebrates up to that point, the limbs were positioned in what anatomists call the sprawling position. The upper arm and upper leg bones extended horizontally from the body, and the limbs then bent downward at the elbow and knee to bring the feet to the ground. This is the posture you see in a modern lizard or crocodile, and while it is perfectly functional, it has a significant mechanical disadvantage. Moving the body forward in this posture requires the trunk to flex from side to side with each step, and this lateral flexion compresses the lungs alternately on each side, which means that a sprawling animal cannot breathe effectively while running at full speed. It must essentially choose between breathing and moving fast, a trade-off known as carrier's constraint, after the biologist who described it. The Therapsids were moving away from this limitation. Their limbs were progressively rotating beneath the body, shifting toward what anatomists call the erect posture, the posture of modern mammals and birds, in which the limbs extend straight down from the body and the trunk moves forward without the dramatic side-to-side flexion. This shift was not complete in the Late Permian Therapsids. They were not yet walking with the fully erect posture of, say, a lion, but they were clearly moving in that direction, and even a partial shift toward more upright limb positioning conferred significant advantages in terms of locomotor efficiency and the ability to sustain activity. The second major innovation was the progressive differentiation of the teeth. In the course of the Therapsid radiation, the simple, peg-like teeth of the earliest synapsids gave way to a much more complex dental apparatus. Different teeth along the tooth row were becoming specialized for different functions. The front teeth, the incisors, were for biting and cutting. Behind them, enlarged, often dramatically enlarged, canine teeth provided weapons for killing prey or for combat with rivals. And behind the canines, the cheek teeth were developing into tools for chewing, for cutting, shearing, or grinding food before it was swallowed. This dental differentiation was enormously significant because it made the processing of food so much more efficient. A modern mammal that chews its food thoroughly before swallowing it can extract far more nutritional value from a given quantity of food than an animal that simply swallows food whole or in large chunks. The mechanical breakdown of food in the mouth dramatically increases the surface area available for digestive enzymes to work on, speeding up digestion and increasing the efficiency of nutrient extraction. For an animal with a high metabolic rate, an animal that needs a lot of energy to fuel its active lifestyle, this improved digestive efficiency was not a luxury, it was a necessity. And this brings us to the third and perhaps most debated innovation, the question of therapsid metabolic rates. Modern reptiles are ectotherms. They rely on external heat sources to warm their bodies and regulate their body temperature. Modern mammals are endotherms. They generate their own body heat internally through metabolic processes and can maintain their body temperature within a narrow range regardless of ambient conditions. The advantage of endothermy is that it allows sustained activity at any temperature, increased brain function, and a host of other physiological benefits. The cost is enormous. Endotherms need to eat far more than ectotherms of equivalent size simply to fuel the metabolic furnace. Where exactly the therapsids of the late Permian sat on this spectrum between cold-blooded ectothermy and fully warm-blooded endothermy is something paleontologists continue to debate and investigate. The fossil record cannot directly tell us a creature's body temperature or metabolic rate, but there are indirect lines of evidence that can inform our thinking. The structure of bone, for example, leaves traces of growth rate and fast-growing bone. The kind associated with high metabolic rates has a characteristic texture that can be distinguished from slow-growing bone under the microscope. And what the bone microstructure of late Permian therapsids tells us is that many of them were growing at rates significantly faster than modern reptiles, rates more comparable to modern mammals. Other lines of evidence, the structure of the nasal passages, which in endotherms often contain elaborate scrolls of bone called turbinates that warm and humidify incoming air and recover heat from outgoing air. The posture and locomotor mechanics, the apparent ecological ability to maintain high activity levels, all point in the same direction. The late Permian therapsids were probably not cold-blooded in the manner of modern reptiles. They were probably somewhere on the spectrum of metabolic elevation, moving toward the warm-blooded condition of modern mammals, even if they had not yet fully arrived there. What this meant in practice was that the therapsids were animals capable of a level of sustained activity, a level of behavioral complexity, and a degree of independence from ambient temperature that set them apart from the other vertebrates of their time. They could be active at dawn and dusk when temperatures were lower. They could function in the cooler seasons when reptilian competitors were sluggish. They could sustain chases, extended searches for food, and complex social interactions in ways that their metabolic inferiors could not. And they had had millions of years, the entire span of the Permian, to refine these abilities, to diversify their forms, to spread across Pangea, to fill every available niche, and to build the complex, interconnected ecological communities that the late Permian is famous for in paleontological circles. Let us now walk out into that world. Let us put ourselves on the ground in the late Permian, in one of those seasonally transitional zones between the coastal forests and the arid interior, where the annual rhythm of wet and dry has organized an extraordinary community of life. It is the wet season. The rains have been falling for weeks, driven by the seasonal onshore winds off the great ocean. The sky is a heavy gray, not stormy but deeply overcast, and the rain falls in steady, drenching sheets that turn the soil to mud and raise the rivers. Everything that was dry and brown and dormant is now wet and green and urgent with life. The vegetation, which had contracted to its minimum during the dry season, is exploding outward. Seed ferns that had appeared to be dead tangles of brown stems are pushing out fresh fronds with extraordinary speed. Ground-covering plants are spreading their leaves across every open surface. Along the river margins, stands of horsetail-like plants and primitive conifers are thick and lush, and moving through this green abundance is a cast of characters that would stop you in your tracks if you could see them. The most immediately striking animals, the ones you would notice first, simply because they are the largest, are the large herbivores. And in the late Permian world, the category of large herbivore is dominated by two extraordinary groups, the Dicynodonts and, to a lesser extent in some regions, a variety of other therapsid and reptilian herbivores whose diversity reflects the richness of the ecosystems they inhabit. The Dicynodonts are, without question, one of the most remarkable evolutionary success stories of the Permian. Their name means something like two dog-toothed, and it refers to the pair of large, tusk-like canine teeth that many members of the group possessed, though in some species these tusks were reduced or absent, and in others they were enormous. But the tusks are not the most interesting thing about the Dicynodonts. The most interesting thing is what their mouths tell us about how they processed food. Most Dicynodonts had lost the majority of their teeth, the complex array of incisors and cheek teeth that other therapsids were developing into more sophisticated tools. In their place, the Dicynodonts had evolved a keratinous beak, something like the beak of a tortoise or a turtle, that covered the front portion of their jaws. This beak was a cropping tool of considerable efficiency. It could bite through tough, fibrous plant material with a combination of shearing force and the leverage provided by the powerful jaw muscles that attached through the enlarged temporal openings of their synapsid skulls. Behind the beak in those Dicynodont species that retained any teeth at all were usually just the two canine tusks, which in many species appear to have served social functions as much as feeding functions, being used in displays or combat between individuals. The actual processing of food was accomplished primarily by the beak and by the back and forth sliding motion of the lower jaw relative to the upper jaw, a kind of shearing or slicing action that could chop plant material into manageable pieces without requiring the complex occlusal surfaces of more typical mammal-like teeth. This relatively simple but highly effective feeding apparatus had allowed the Dicynodonts to become generalist plant eaters of extraordinary success. They were not specialists on any particular type of vegetation. They could eat a wide variety of plant types: ferns, seed ferns, low-growing ground cover, possibly the softer parts of woody plants. This dietary breadth made them remarkably resistant to the kinds of resource fluctuations that would have troubled more specialized feeders, and it contributed to their success in the variable, seasonally shifting environments of Pangea, and their success was extraordinary. The Dicynodonts were not merely present in the late Permian world, they were abundant. In some fossil deposits from the late Permian of what is now South Africa, the famous Karoo Basin, which has produced some of the richest records of late Permian life anywhere on Earth, Dicynodont fossils make up a large majority of all the vertebrate specimens found. This dominance in the fossil record is a reasonable proxy for dominance in life. Dicynodonts were the dominant large herbivores of the late Permian world, the buffalo and wildebeest of their time, present in numbers that drove the structure of the ecosystems they inhabited. They came in a range of sizes, which was itself ecologically important. The smallest Dicynodonts were no bigger than a large rat, nimble and quick and probably exploiting resources, seeds, roots, insect larvae, that were unavailable to their larger relatives. The medium-sized forms, perhaps the size of a sheep or a large dog, were probably the most numerically abundant and ecologically central, filling the role of the middling herbivore whose population dynamics set the pace for everything else in the ecosystem. And the largest Dicynodonts were impressive animals by any standard, some reaching sizes comparable to a modern cow, their heavy bodies moving through the vegetation with a deliberate, powerful efficiency that spoke of animals at the very top of the herbivore size class. All of these animals, across their range of sizes, were doing the same essential thing, eating plants, converting plant material into animal tissue, and in doing so making the energy fixed by those plants available to the carnivores that would eat them. They were the middle link in the great chain of energy transfer that organized the late Permian terrestrial ecosystem, and without them, without their extraordinary abundance and diversity, nothing else about that ecosystem makes sense. Now let us look at what the Dicynodonts were eating, because the plants of the late Permian world deserve as much attention as the animals, and they are perhaps even less familiar to most audiences. The late Permian is a world before flowers. This simple fact reshapes everything we might assume about what a terrestrial landscape looked like at this time. The flowering plants, the angiosperms that dominate the modern world, that give us our grasses and our broad-leaved trees and our wildflowers, had not yet appeared. The evolutionary events that would eventually produce the flowering plants lay far in the future. The world of the late Permian was colored differently, structured differently, and provided different resources to the animals that depended on it. Instead of flowers, the late Permian landscape was clothed in a flora dominated by several groups of plants that are either extinct today or represented only by a few surviving relatives at the margins of the modern world. Seed ferns were among the most important. These were not true ferns, despite the name. They were a diverse group of plants that reproduced by seeds rather than spores, and many of them had large, sometimes very large, fern-like fronds that gave the landscape a distinctly alien character to modern eyes. Some seed ferns were ground-level plants, their fronds spreading out in radiating fans from a central growing point. Others were more tree-like, with woody trunks and a crown of fronds reaching several meters into the air. They were widely distributed across the vegetated zones of Pangea, from the humid coastal regions to the drier transitional zones, and they provided enormous quantities of biomass for the herbivore community. Alongside the seed ferns were the true ferns, spore-reproducing plants that required at least some moisture to complete their life cycle, which meant they were most abundant near water sources, but could also colonize rocky slopes and disturbed ground where their spores could germinate and grow. The ferns of the late Permian included forms recognizable to modern eyes, graceful fronds arching from a central stem, and forms that would seem more exotic, particularly the tree ferns, which could reach substantial heights and created a distinctive middle-story canopy in the more humid forest zones. The horsetails, plants in the lineage of the modern equisetum, were another important element of the late Permian flora. These were plants with jointed, hollow stems and whorls of reduced leaves at each joint, growing in dense stands particularly in wet or waterlogged soils along river margins and lake shores. They were not highly nutritious compared to seed ferns or the early conifers, but they were available year-round in the wettest zones, and the Dicynodonts and other large herbivores were certainly capable of eating them. And then there were the early conifers, the ancestors of the pines and spruces and firs of the modern world, though in the late Permian they did not look much like their modern descendants. Late Permian conifers tended to be more variable in form, sometimes with broader, strap-shaped leaves rather than the needles of their modern relatives, and their growth habits were diverse. Some were shrubby, others tree-like, and they were particularly important in the drier zones of Pangea, where their drought tolerance gave them an advantage over the more moisture-dependent seed ferns and ferns. This diverse flora was not evenly distributed across Pangea. It formed a mosaic of distinct plant communities, each responding to local conditions of moisture, temperature, soil quality, and elevation. The lush seed fern forests of the humid coastal margins gave way to more open, mixed communities in the semi-arid transitional zones, which in turn gave way to sparse, drought-adapted scrublands in the deep interior. And within each of these zones, the plants formed layered communities with distinct canopy, understory, and ground-level components that created a structural complexity that was itself ecologically important, providing food resources at different heights, shelter and nesting opportunities, and the physical architecture through which animals moved and hid and hunted. This vegetative complexity was not an incidental backdrop. It was a fundamental organizing force for the animal communities that depended on it. The structure of the plant communities determined what was available to eat, where it could be found, how easy it was to access, and how it varied seasonally. And the animal communities responded to that structure with exquisite precision, their behaviors, their body forms, their life histories all shaped by the particular vegetation they had evolved with. But we cannot spend all our time with the herbivores. We have to talk about the predators, and in the late Permian world, the pinnacle of the terrestrial predator guild was occupied by one of the most extraordinary groups of animals ever to walk the face of this planet. The Gorgonopsians, The name itself has a fearsome ring to it, and the animals earned that character. Gorgonopsians were large therapsid predators, members of the Synapsid lineage, and therefore, in the deep genealogical sense, relatives of ourselves that had evolved into the apex predators of the late Permian terrestrial world. They were, in their ecological role and in their physical impressiveness, the large predatory cats of their time. The lions, the leopards, the saber-toothed cats, except that the saber-toothed Gorgonopsians had their formidable weaponry long before any true cat had yet evolved. The most immediately striking feature of a Gorgonopsian was its teeth. The canine teeth in particular were extraordinary, long, laterally compressed, and in the larger species reaching sizes that would not look out of place in an illustration of a saber-toothed cat. These were not teeth for grinding or chewing. They were teeth for killing, for driving through the thick hide and the muscle and the bone of prey animals that were, in many cases, substantially larger than the Gorgonopsian itself. How did a Gorgonopsian kill? The mechanics have been studied extensively, and the picture that emerges is of a predator with a different style than most modern large cats. The jaw could open to an extraordinary gape. The anatomy of the skull allowed the lower jaw to drop far further than a modern carnivore's, creating the clearance necessary for those enormous canines to be fully deployed and driven into prey. The strike would have been a powerful downward thrust, the full force of the neck and head muscles driving the canines into the prey, penetrating deeply and inflicting catastrophic wounds. This was not a predator that killed with a sustained bite and suffocation in the manner of a modern lion. This was a predator that killed with a series of devastating stab wounds, slashing strikes that opened enormous wounds and caused rapid blood loss. The Gorgonopsians ranged considerably in size. The smallest species were perhaps wolf-sized, still formidable predators by any measure, capable of taking down prey considerably larger than themselves. The largest Gorgonopsians were genuinely impressive animals, with skull lengths approaching half a meter and body masses that must have run into several hundred kilograms. These giant species, like an Ostranceivia, known from fossils found in what is now Russia, were among the largest terrestrial predators of their time, and they were almost certainly capable of attacking and killing even the largest Dicynodonts. But Gorgonopsians were not the only predators of the late Permian. The predator community was more complex than any single dominant species, and understanding that complexity helps us appreciate the sophistication of the ecosystems in question. Alongside the Gorgonopsians were other therapsid predators, most notably the Therosphalians, a diverse group of meat-eating therapsids that ranged from small, swift hunters targeting small vertebrates and invertebrates all the way up to substantial predators capable of challenging the smaller Gorgonopsians for prey. The Therosphalians were in many ways anatomically more advanced than the Gorgonopsians. Their skulls show features that suggest a closer approach to the mammalian condition, and some of them may have had relatively high metabolic rates that supported active, sustained predatory strategies. There were also early archosauriform reptiles, members of the lineage that would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, crocodilians, and birds, beginning to make their presence felt in the late Permian predator guild. These were not yet the dominant forces they would become in the Triassic period that followed the Permian, but they were present, they were diversifying, and their eventual rise would be one of the defining features of the post-extinction recovery. For now, in the late Permian, they were subordinate players in an ecosystem still thoroughly dominated by the therapsid synapsids. And then, lurking in the ecological background but important in their own right, were the Pariasaurs, not predators, but large, heavily armored herbivores that deserve a mention as one of the more unusual characters in the Permian cast. Pariasaurs were reptiles, not therapsids, that had evolved a body plan of substantial size and impressively sturdy construction. They were broad, heavily built animals with thick, lumpy skin that was sometimes reinforced with bony osteoderms, small plates of bone embedded directly in the skin, giving them a somewhat armored appearance. They ate plants, probably relying on their size and armor for protection rather than on speed or agility, and they filled an ecological niche somewhat similar to that of modern large reptilian herbivores. The coexistence of these different herbivore types, Dicynodonts, Dinosaurs, and the various smaller herbivorous Synapsids and reptiles, meant that the plant biomass of the late Permian landscape was being exploited from multiple angles simultaneously, with different species targeting different plant types, different plant parts, and different microhabitats. This diversity of herbivores was not merely variety for its own sake. It was the expression of a mature, well-developed ecological community in which the available resources had been partitioned among competitors over millions of years of evolutionary interaction, each lineage carving out its particular way of making a living in a way that reduced direct competition and allowed the coexistence of more species than a less differentiated community could support. We have been dwelling on the land, but we must not neglect the margins, the places where the terrestrial and aquatic worlds blurred together, because in the late Permian, these marginal zones were ecologically crucial and biologically fascinating. The rivers and lakes of Pangea were not merely sources of drinking water for the terrestrial animals that came to their banks. They were ecosystems in their own right, full of life, and they formed critical interfaces between the terrestrial world and the aquatic world that supported an extraordinary community of organisms specially adapted to exploit that interface. The most ancient of these interface specialists were the amphibians, animals that required water to reproduce, laying eggs that had to remain moist and whose larvae were fully aquatic, breathing through gills before metamorphosing into the somewhat more terrestrial adult form. By the late Permian, the amphibians had a very long history indeed. They had been the dominant large vertebrates of the Carboniferous period before the amniotes rose to preeminence, and they had diversified into a remarkable range of forms, many of them quite different from the frogs, salamanders, and caecilians that represent the survivors of the group in the modern world. The late Permian amphibians included some animals of considerable size. Temnospondyls, a diverse and long-lived amphibian lineage, were present in the rivers and lakes of Pangea in the form of species that ranged from small, salamander-like forms to large, flat-headed, crocodile-like predators that lurked in the shallows and lunged at prey that came to drink. Some of these large temnospondyls were genuinely formidable in their aquatic domain, with broad, flat skulls and wide jaws studded with numerous conical teeth that would have made escape for any similarly sized animal that came within reach very difficult. These large aquatic amphibians were not the only predators at the waterside, of course. Gorgonopsians and other terrestrial predators certainly came to water sources, and the margins of rivers and lakes would have been places of heightened danger and heightened ecological interaction, zones where the rules of the terrestrial ecosystem and the rules of the aquatic ecosystem overlapped and sometimes clashed. A large temnospondyl that was a confident predator in the water became vulnerable to a Gorgonopsian if it was drawn onto land. Conversely, a large Dicynodont that was well protected on land by its bulk might be vulnerable to aquatic predation when it waded into the water to drink or to access aquatic plants. These zones of ecological overlap, these tension-filled interfaces between different worlds, were among the most dynamic and productive areas of the late Permian landscape. They concentrated biodiversity. They brought together species that would not ordinarily interact. And they created opportunities for predation, competition, and ecological interaction that drove evolutionary change in ways that the more uniform environments of the deep interior or the open ocean simply could not. The small forms at these margins deserve attention, too. Not every animal at the waterside was large. Smaller amphibians of various sorts picked insects and other invertebrates from the muddy margins. Small reptiles scurried among the rocks and root tangles of the river bank. And the invertebrate life of the late Permian rivers and lakes was itself rich and complex. Aquatic insects in various larval stages, freshwater crustaceans, various worm-like invertebrates, all contributing to the food webs that supported the larger vertebrates. It is easy to overlook the invertebrates in any account of prehistoric life because they so rarely fossilize in the dramatic, three-dimensional way that large vertebrate skeletons do. But they were the backbone of the food webs, the primary consumers at the base of many trophic chains, the nutrient recyclers, the soil builders, the engineers of the physical environment. Without them, the magnificent animals we have been describing could not have existed. They were the invisible foundation of everything. Let us now travel in our imagination from the land to the sea. Because while the terrestrial drama of the late Permian has been our primary focus, the ocean, the vast, world-encircling Panthalassa and its subsidiary basins, was running its own extraordinary story at the same time. The late Permian Ocean was not the same ocean that covers our world today. The continental geography was completely different, which means the patterns of ocean circulation were completely different, without the Drake Passage between South America and Antarctica. Without the Atlantic Ocean, without the Arctic Basin as we know it, the circulation of water and heat around the planet followed pathways that no longer exist, driven by the particular arrangement of land and sea that Pangea created. Panthalassa, the great ocean, was essentially a global ocean. It stretched from the tropics to the polar regions on both sides, and it had regions of very different character. In the warm, shallow, sunlit tropical zones near the coasts of Pangea, reef-building organisms created some of the most productive and complex marine ecosystems on the planet. The Permian reefs were not built primarily by corals of the kinds that build modern reefs. The reef-building fauna of the Permian was dominated by different organisms, including a variety of brachiopods, bryozoans, and other filter-feeding invertebrates, along with calcareous sponges that formed the structural framework of the reef itself. These Permian reefs were centers of extraordinary marine biodiversity. Like modern reefs, they provided physical complexity, crevices and caves and overhangs that sheltered a huge variety of organisms. They supported grazing and browsing animals that fed on algae and encrusting organisms. They sheltered predators that ambushed prey from the complex structure of the reef itself. And they were surrounded by the open water of the reef lagoon and the deeper reef slope, each zone with its own characteristic community of organisms. Among the vertebrate life of the late Permian Ocean, the sharks hold a special place. By the late Permian, sharks had an ancestry stretching back over 400 million years, making them one of the oldest continuously surviving vertebrate lineages on Earth. And in the late Permian, they had diversified into a remarkable range of forms that filled predatory roles at multiple levels of the marine food web. The early sharks of the late Permian period were not identical to the great white sharks and tiger sharks of the modern ocean, but they were recognizably shark-like in their essential design: fusiform bodies, cartilaginous skeletons, multiple rows of teeth that were continuously replaced throughout life, and the sensory sophistication that has made sharks such effective predators for such an enormous span of time. The lateral line system that detects pressure waves in the water. The ampullae of Lorenzini that detect weak electrical fields generated by the muscles of prey animals. The acute olfactory system that can detect trace amounts of chemical signals in the water. All of these predatory tools were already present and functioning in the sharks of the late Permian Ocean. The ecological role of these sharks in the late Permian marine ecosystem was the role that apex predators play in any ecosystem. They were the controllers of population dynamics in the communities they preyed upon, their hunting behavior and hunting preferences shaping the behavior and population sizes of their prey in ways that cascaded through the entire food web. A shark that preferentially hunted a particular kind of fish would, by its hunting pressure, keep that fish's population in check, and that check would have downstream effects on whatever that fish itself ate, and so on down through the trophic levels. Below the sharks in the marine food web were the fish, a vast and diverse assemblage of bony fish and other fish groups that filled every conceivable role in the open ocean and coastal waters. Some were planktivores, swimming with open mouths through the sunlit surface waters and filtering out the tiny zooplankton that fed on the phytoplankton. Some were mid-water predators, pursuing smaller fish through the open water column. Some were bottom-dwelling forms that probed the sediment for invertebrates buried there. Some were coral reef-associated species that spent their lives within the physical shelter of the reef structure. And below the fish in the water column, below even the plankton-feeding fish, were the planktonic organisms themselves, the phytoplankton that converted sunlight and dissolved nutrients into organic matter through photosynthesis, and the zooplankton that fed on the phytoplankton. These microscopic and near-microscopic organisms were, in a very real sense, the foundation of the entire marine food web. Without their productivity, without the billions upon billions of photosynthetic cells converting sunlight energy into biological matter every day across the surface of Panthalassa, nothing else in the ocean could function. They were the base, the source, the beginning of everything marine. The Late Permian marine ecosystem was, by any measure, a sophisticated and productive system. It had had hundreds of millions of years to develop its complexity, to refine its food webs, to evolve its ecological relationships. The organisms in it were not simplistic or primitive. They were highly evolved, highly specialized, intricately interdependent members of a community that had proven its resilience through enormous spans of geological time. And yet all of this complexity, all of this richness, all of this magnificent, layered, ancient, self-sustaining vitality, both on land and in the sea, was fragile in ways that were not yet apparent. The equilibrium that the late Permian world represented was real, but it was contingent. It depended on conditions remaining within certain bounds. It depended on the slow, gradual pace of change that geological and climatic systems normally operated at, a pace that living systems could track and adapt to over generations and centuries and millennia. What the late Permian world was not prepared for, what no ecosystem in the history of life has ever been prepared for, was the kind of sudden, massive, and sustained disruption that was approaching from beneath the Earth's surface, building slowly in the depths of the mantle, centuries and millennia, before it would erupt into the biosphere with consequences that would reshape the living world more fundamentally than anything since. But that is a story for later. For now, let us remain in the late Permian at its peak. Let us spend a little more time appreciating the world as it was before the unraveling began, because the tragedy of the end Permian extinction is not just about what was destroyed. It is about what was there to be destroyed, about the magnificence and the complexity and the sheer biological achievement that the world had accumulated and what was lost when it fell apart. There is a particular kind of ecological relationship that deserves our attention before we go any further, and that is the relationship between the large herbivores and the landscape itself. Because in the late Permian, as in all ecosystems where large herbivores are present in abundance, the animals were not merely passengers on the landscape. They were active sculptors of it, shaping the vegetation and the physical environment in ways that fed back into the conditions of their own existence. Think about how a large population of Dicynodonts would interact with the vegetation they depended on. In their feeding, they would remove biomass from the plant community, cropping fronds, stripping leaves, digging up roots. In areas where their densities were high, this removal of biomass could be substantial enough to open up the vegetation, creating gaps in what would otherwise be dense plant cover, letting light reach the ground, stimulating the growth of new, young plants that were often more nutritious than older, more mature vegetation. Their trampling also had effects. Large, heavy animals moving through vegetation compress the soil, break stems and branches, push down tall plants, and create physical disturbance that changes the competitive landscape for plants. Species that can recover quickly from disturbance, fast-growing, opportunistic plants thrive in disturbed areas. Species that require stable, undisturbed conditions are pushed out. The result is a vegetation mosaic shaped in part by the animals themselves, with patches of intensively grazed, disturbed vegetation interspersed with patches of less disturbed, denser growth. The movement patterns of the large herbivores mattered too. Dicynodonts were not randomly distributed across the landscape. They concentrated around water sources during the dry season. They moved with the vegetation during the wet season, following the green flush of new growth as it spread across the landscape. Their trails wore paths through the vegetation that became routes for other animals. Their wallowing in wet areas, if they did wallow, as many large modern herbivores do, created small pools and disturbed areas that provided habitat for other species. And then there were their droppings. The dung of large herbivores is a concentrated package of organic matter and nutrients, and in the late Permian as today, it was a resource exploited by a variety of organisms. Dung beetles or their Permian equivalents would have processed it. Fungi would have colonized it. The nutrients it contained would have been released back into the soil and made available to plants. The large herbivores were not just consuming the landscape, they were fertilizing it, redistributing nutrients across it in ways that maintained the productivity of the very vegetation they depended on. This feedback loop between large herbivores and their vegetation, the way the animals shaped the landscape and the landscape shaped the animals, was a fundamental dynamic of the late Permian terrestrial ecosystem. It was one of the mechanisms by which the ecosystem maintained its own stability, its own equilibrium. When herbivore populations grew too large and began to overgraze, the vegetation would decline, reducing the food base, leading to starvation and population decline, which would reduce grazing pressure and allow the vegetation to recover. When herbivore populations fell too low, vegetation would grow dense and tall and perhaps less accessible and less nutritious for the remaining herbivores, which might then reduce their own pressure on the ecosystem by moving to more productive areas. These feedback mechanisms, these negative feedbacks that kept the system within certain bounds, were not the product of any design or intention. They were the emergent consequence of the evolutionary relationships between plants and herbivores, between predators and prey, between organisms and their physical environment that had developed over millions of years of shared history. They were the reason the late Permian ecosystems were stable, not because they were static or unchanging, but because they had multiple mechanisms for returning to equilibrium after small perturbations, multiple ways of absorbing and responding to the normal variations in climate and resources that any ecosystem must deal with. Stability in ecology does not mean immobility. It means resilience, the capacity to absorb disturbance and return to a functional state. And the late Permian ecosystems had resilience in abundance, built up over the long evolutionary history of the organisms that composed them and the ecological relationships that bound those organisms together. The question of communication and behavior in these ancient animals is one that paleontology can only partially answer, but it is worth reflecting on because it speaks to the richness of what the late Permian world actually was, not just a collection of body plans, but a world of living, behaving, social organisms. We know from the anatomy of late Permian therapsids that many of them had sensory systems of considerable sophistication. The enlarged temporal openings of their skulls, the synapsid hallmark, provided space for jaw muscles that also functioned in facial expression. The trend toward more mammal-like skulls in the therapsids included progressive elaboration of the structures of the inner ear, moving toward the kind of hearing that modern mammals possess, hearing that extends into higher frequency ranges than most reptiles can detect, and that allows more nuanced perception of the acoustic environment. What this means in behavioral terms is that the late Permian therapsids were probably capable of more sophisticated acoustic communication than their reptilian contemporaries. Vocalizations, calls of alarm, courtship sounds, parent-offspring communication become possible as the hearing apparatus becomes more refined. We cannot know for certain whether late Permian therapsids vocalized in these ways, but the anatomy is suggestive, and the ecological and social contexts in which they lived, congregating around water sources, apparently living in groups based on patterns of bone accumulation at some fossil localities, would have made the ability to communicate very useful. Visual communication was certainly important. The tusks of Dicynodonts, as we noted, were probably social signals as much as feeding tools in many species. Their size and shape could have communicated information about the fitness and dominant status of an individual. The postures of Gorgonopsians during predatory encounters or territorial disputes would have conveyed information about aggression and intent. These were not automatons moving through the landscape without awareness of each other. They were social organisms, aware of their neighbors, reading signals, making decisions based on the behavior of others. The parent-offspring relationship in the late Permian Synapsids is a matter of particular interest. In modern mammals, parental care is universal and often extended. Mothers, and sometimes fathers, invest enormous amounts of energy and time in the survival of their offspring. This investment is tied to the production of relatively small numbers of offspring, each of whom represents a substantial biological investment. The reproductive strategy of mammals, few offspring, high investment, is the opposite of the strategy of most fish and many reptiles, which produce large numbers of offspring and invest little in individual survival. The evidence from the fossil record suggests that at least some late Permian therapsids were moving toward the mammalian end of this spectrum. Nesting behavior has been tentatively suggested by some fossil localities. The physiological inference of elevated metabolic rates implies that young therapsids, like young mammals, may have required warmth and care from their parents rather than simply hatching from eggs and fending for themselves. The milk-producing glands that are the hallmark of true mammals had not yet evolved in these animals. That was a mammalian innovation that lay in the future, but precursors to parental care, to the investment of energy and attention in the survival of individual offspring, may already have been present in the most advanced late Permian therapsids. If so, this would have profound implications for the social and behavioral complexity of these animals. Parental care creates context for learning, for offspring to acquire behaviors and skills from their parents that go beyond what is encoded genetically. It creates social bonds that persist beyond the immediate necessity of reproduction. It creates the scaffolding for more complex social structures, and it creates selection pressure for the cognitive abilities, the memory, the learning capacity, the social intelligence that parental care requires. In other words, the late Permian therapsids were not merely anatomically sophisticated. They were, in all probability, behaviorally sophisticated in ways that their ancestors could not have approached. They were animals with complex lives, complex social worlds, complex relationships with their environment and with each other. And this sophistication was itself a product and a marker of the long evolutionary journey that the synapsids had undertaken across the Permian. A journey toward a kind of biological complexity that would eventually, through the long and tortuous path of evolution, produce the enormous diversity of mammals that inhabit the modern world, including the particular mammal who is listening to these words right now. As the late Permian reached what we might call its ecological zenith, the period of maximum diversity and complexity in the terrestrial ecosystems, somewhere in the range of 260 to 255 million years ago, the world was, from the perspective of the organisms living in it, simply the world. The conditions they inhabited were not the conditions of a world on the edge of catastrophe. They were the normal conditions of existence, the environment that their physiology and behavior and ecology had been shaped to navigate. The seasons came and went, the rains arrived and departed, predators hunted and prey animals fled or fought back, plants grew and were eaten and grew again. The annual pulse of the Pangean rhythm continued as it had continued for millions of years. But the fossil record tells us, with the benefit of hindsight, that the equilibrium of the late Permian was already showing signs of stress. Not catastrophic stress, not the kind of collapse that would come later, but subtle, gradual signs that the balance was under pressure. The diversity of some groups, particularly some of the smaller, more specialized species within various lineages, seems to have been declining somewhat in the very latest Permian, before the main extinction event began. The fossil beds that record this pre-extinction period sometimes show a slight thinning of the variety of species present, a slight simplification of the community structure. These early signs of change are difficult to read from the fossil record, partly because the preservation of fossils is inherently incomplete and patchy, and partly because distinguishing a real biological signal from the noise of preservation bias and geological variation requires careful statistical analysis of large data sets. But paleontologists who have devoted careers to studying the late Permian fossil record, particularly the extraordinarily rich record of the Karoo Basin, do see patterns in those final millions of years before the main extinction event that suggest the system was not entirely stable. The food chains were perhaps becoming a little more fragile at their ends. The most specialized species, the ones that occupied the narrowest ecological niches and therefore had the least flexibility in response to environmental variation, were the first to feel any increase in stress. Their populations would have fluctuated more widely. Local extinctions would have happened more frequently. The buffer of population size and geographic range that protects species from extinction was being eroded slowly, in ways that would not have been obvious to any observer at the time, but that are visible dimly in the patterns of the fossil record. The stage was being set. The actors were in place, living their complex and interconnected lives in their ancient, rhythmic world. The ecological drama of the late Permian was still playing, still vibrant, still magnificently alive. But beneath the surface, in the deep rocks, in the churning convection of the mantle, something was building that would change everything. Something immense, something geological, something that operated on timescales and with forces that no living thing could adapt to or escape from. The Siberian Traps were waiting, and the world did not know it was waiting with them. Before we reach that point, before we allow the darkness to fall on this ancient world, let us make one final journey through its landscapes and its creatures. Let us give the late Permian world its full due. Let us stand one last time in the long light of a Pangean afternoon during the late wet season, when everything is at its most lush and most alive, and look around at what this extraordinary chapter of Earth's history had produced. The wet season afternoon is warm but not oppressive. The rains have pulled back for a few hours, and the sky has cleared to a luminous, hazy blue unmarked by any clouds except a few tall cumulus that have built over the interior. The light slants in from the west, long and golden, and it illuminates a landscape that is, in its own strange, ancient way, beautiful. In the middle distance, a herd of medium-sized Dicynodonts, a group of perhaps 30 animals, mixed ages, the young ones staying close to the larger adults, moves steadily through an open area of mixed seed fern and ground-covering plants. They move with a deliberate, heavy-bodied efficiency, their beaked mouths cropping fronds and low vegetation in a steady rhythm, their bodies rocking gently with each step. They are not panicked. They are alert, their small eyes scanning the surroundings, their nostrils testing the air, but they are calm. This is what they do. This is the fundamental activity around which their lives are organized, eating. Off to one side, at the margin of a stand of tree ferns, two large periasaurs move slowly through the shade. Their broad, lumpy bodies are a muted brown-gray, and they are nearly invisible against the shadowed vegetation. They are feeding on the lower fronds of the tree ferns, reaching up to drag them down with their jaws, their small eyes half closed in what looks, for all the world, like contentment. They are not beautiful animals by conventional standards, too broad, too ungainly, too heavily armored for elegance. But there is something deeply satisfying about the way they move, the way they occupy their particular corner of the landscape with such complete appropriateness. Closer to the river, a group of smaller Synapsids move nervously through the undergrowth. These are probably juveniles or smaller adult species of one of the many smaller herbivorous lineages, animals at the scale of a large rabbit or a small dog, quick and cautious, their eyes large and their reflexes sharp. They are exploiting the fallen seed fern fronds at the edge of the feeding zone that the larger Dicynodonts have opened up, finding seeds and insects disturbed by the passage of larger animals. They are not the stars of the late Permian ecosystem. They are the supporting cast, the small and overlooked organisms whose combined ecological impact is perhaps greater than that of any single large species. And somewhere at the edge of vision, at the boundary between the open feeding ground and the denser vegetation beyond, something else is moving, something that moves with a different quality of intention. Something that does not step carefully and steadily in the manner of a grazing animal, but that moves with a low, fluid efficiency that speaks of a different purpose entirely. The Gorgonopsian pauses at the edge of the vegetation. It is a large one, an adult, well-muscled, its head broad and its canines just visible past the line of its upper lip. Its eyes are fixed on the herd of Dicynodonts in the middle distance. It is reading them, reading their spacing, their attention, the direction of their movement, the position of the young ones relative to the adults. It is calculating in the way that all predators calculate the probability of a successful strike against different targets. The Dicynodonts have not seen it yet, but they are not unaware. Something, a shift in the air, a faint sound, some subtle cue that their senses have registered at a level below conscious processing, has made them tighten their formation slightly. The adults are moving a little closer together. The juveniles are pressed against the sides of the largest adults. The herd's pace has increased almost imperceptibly. The Gorgonopsian moves. What follows is one of the most fundamental dramas of the living world, played out on the stage of the late Permian as it has been played out on every stage where predators and prey have shared a landscape from the Cambrian to the present. The burst of speed, the scattering of the prey. The isolation of an individual, the pursuit, the turn and the counter-turn, the application of force, the strike, and then the stillness and the feeding and the circling of smaller animals at a respectful distance waiting for their share of what remains. This is the late Permian in its full, living, predatory, prey-fleeing, plant-eating, sun-warmed, rain-soaked reality. This is the world that existed in all its complexity and its beauty and its ferocity for millions of years. This is the world that was built, layer by ecological layer, evolutionary innovation by evolutionary innovation, over the entire span of the Permian and the long Carboniferous that preceded it. This is the world that the Synapsids made, and that the Synapsids dominated, and that the Synapsids and their companions, the Periasaurs and the Throphalians and the amphibians and the early archosaurs and the invertebrates and the plants, had together assembled into one of the most complex and successful biological communities this planet had ever seen. It was a world worthy of celebration. It was a world worthy of deep, careful attention. And it was a world that, for all its resilience and its sophistication, was about to face something it had no way of surviving intact. The great experiment of the late Permian, this long, magnificent, biologically extraordinary chapter of Earth's history, was approaching its final pages, and the story of how it ended and what came after and what was lost and what survived is a story that we will tell in the chapters that follow. But for now, as we close this first chapter of our journey, let us simply sit with the world as it was. Let us honor the late Permian in its fullness, the vast red deserts and the lush coastal forests, the baking interior and the rain-swept margins, the herds of Dicynodonts and the prowling Gorgonopsians, the reef-building communities of the ancient ocean and the sharks that hunted through them, the small, quick, overlooked organisms that held the food webs together from below, and the ancient, patient plants that made it all possible. Let us recognize this world for what it was, not a prelude to something else, not merely a setting for the disaster that followed, but a complete and extraordinary chapter of life's history in its own right, a chapter that lasted for tens of millions of years and produced biological complexity and ecological sophistication of a caliber that deserves our full admiration and our deepest respect. Because in the story of life on this planet, the late Permian is not a footnote. It is not a stepping stone. It is a destination, a high water mark of biological achievement that took an almost incomprehensible span of time to build, and that fell with a speed and a totality that still staggers the imagination of every scientist who studies it. What happened next, what the volcanoes did, how the climate changed, how the food webs unraveled, how the most successful animals on land and in the sea were brought to the edge of oblivion and beyond, that is the next chapter of our story. And it is a chapter that, once you understand it, changes the way you see everything alive today. Every mammal that exists, from the smallest shrew to the largest whale, carries within its biology the legacy of the therapsid synapsids that survived the end Permian catastrophe. Every ecosystem that has ever developed on this planet since the Permian ended was built on the ruins of what the Permian world had been. And the questions raised by the end Permian extinction about the fragility of complex systems, about the limits of biological adaptability, about the relationship between geological processes and the fate of living things, are questions that resonate far beyond the Permian world itself. But those are questions for part 2 of our journey. For now, as the late Permian sun sets over the ancient landscape of Pangea, and the Gorgonopsians settle in for the night with full bellies, and the Dicynodonts huddle together in the last warmth of the evening air, and the ancient ocean moves through its own eternal rhythms far away to the west, for now we rest. We remember what was here, we carry it with us, and we prepare for what comes next. We left the late Permian world at the height of its power. We left it in full sunlight, full of life, full of the extraordinary biological complexity that hundreds of millions of years of evolution had assembled with such patient, relentless ingenuity. We left the Dicynodonts feeding in the long afternoon light, the Gorgonopsians moving through the shadows at the edge of the vegetation, the ancient ocean rolling through its rhythms around the margins of Pangea, the reefs teeming with life, the river margins alive with the sounds and movements of a world that did not know what was coming. Now we return, and the world we return to is the same world, the same Pangea, the same ancient continent with its seasonal pulse and its magnificent biological communities. But time has moved forward and something has changed. Something subtle at first, barely perceptible against the background noise of normal ecological variation. Something that the animals themselves could not have sensed or responded to in any meaningful way, because it operated on timescales far beyond the reach of individual experience. But something that the fossil record, studied by generations of dedicated paleontologists working through the rocks of ancient Pangea, the Karoo Basin, the Ural region, the ancient sediments of what is now China, has revealed in careful, painstaking detail. The world of the late Permian was beginning to change. And the change, once it began in earnest, would not stop until it had done something that had never been done before and has never been done since. It would bring the living world to the very edge of biological annihilation. This is the story of the great dying. This is the story of how a world of extraordinary complexity and beauty unraveled. And it begins not with a bang, not with a sudden catastrophe that arrived without warning, but with something far more insidious. It begins with the slow, accumulating pressure of a geological process that was running its course thousands of kilometers away from the ecosystems it would ultimately destroy. It begins beneath the ground, beneath what is today the vast, flat plain of Siberia, a region of boreal forests and permafrost and enormous rivers that drains eventually into the Arctic Ocean. There is evidence of one of the most dramatic geological events in the history of this planet. The evidence is written in the rock itself, in an enormous province of ancient volcanic material that covers an area of roughly 2 million square kilometers, reaching thicknesses of several kilometers in places, representing the solidified remnants of one of the greatest outpourings of volcanic material the Earth has ever produced. Geologists call this feature the Siberian Traps. The word traps comes from the Swedish word for stairs, and it refers to the stepped, terraced appearance of the eroded lava flows when seen in cross-section. each flow a separate step in a geological staircase built from fire. And the Siberian Traps were produced not by any ordinary volcanic eruption, not by the kind of explosive, cone-building volcanism that we associate with well-known modern volcanoes, but by a fundamentally different kind of volcanic process, a large igneous province eruption, or lip. In a large igneous province eruption, magma does not find its way to the surface through a narrow conduit and build a cone. Instead, it finds a series of fissures, cracks in the crust, and pours out through them across an enormous area, flooding the landscape with lava and flows that can extend for hundreds of kilometers. Individual lava flows in the Siberian Traps were sometimes tens of meters thick and extended across areas that would dwarf any modern lava field, and these flows were not isolated events. They were repeated over and over for a period estimated at somewhere between 1 and 2 million years, each eruption adding more material, more gas, more energy to a cumulative process that was reshaping the surface and the atmosphere of a significant fraction of the planet. The sheer volume of material involved is almost impossible to intuitively grasp. We are talking about several million cubic kilometers of volcanic material brought to the surface, lava, ash, volcanic gases, over the course of what is, in geological terms, a relatively short period. The eruptions that built the Siberian Traps were not the largest volcanic events in Earth's entire history, but they are among the largest of the past billion years, and they happen to occur at a time when the biosphere was at a particular state of organization and vulnerability that maximized their impact. But here is the thing that makes the Siberian Traps the killer, the mechanism of extinction, the geological force that ended the Permian world. It was not the lava itself that did the damage. The lava flows were devastating locally, of course, nothing that lived on the landscape directly overrun by a flowing river of molten rock at temperatures of over 1,000 degrees could survive. But the lava stayed in Siberia. It did not cross oceans. It did not reach the distant ecosystems of the southern Karoo or the tropical reefs of Tethys. What the lava did not stay was the gas. Volcanic eruptions release enormous quantities of gases into the atmosphere. The most significant of these in terms of their climate impact are sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, and various halogen compounds. The sulfur dioxide is a short-term problem. It forms sulfate aerosols in the upper atmosphere that reflect sunlight back into space, cooling the Earth temporarily, causing what we might call volcanic winters that can last for years or decades. These cooling pulses, repeated over the course of the Siberian Traps eruptions, would have added stress to the ecosystems of the Late Permian, disrupting the seasonal patterns that so much of the biota depended on, reducing the productivity of plant communities that drove the entire food web. But the sulfur dioxide pulses were temporary. The sulfate aerosols settled out of the atmosphere within years to decades, and the cooling they caused was temporary. They were a recurring shock, a series of cold pulses that disrupted the system, but not in themselves a killing mechanism on the scale of what actually happened. The carbon dioxide was different. Carbon dioxide does not form aerosols and settle out. It stays in the atmosphere, it accumulates. And over time, decades, centuries, millennia, its accumulation drives a warming of the climate through the greenhouse effect that is persistent and progressive, not temporary. Each pulse of volcanic activity added more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and over the 1 to 2 million years of the Siberian Traps eruptions, the amount of carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere was enormous. The result was a progressive warming of the global climate, not dramatic on the timescale of a human lifetime or even of many human generations, but relentless on the timescale of the geological record, measurable in the patterns of ancient isotopes preserved in the rocks. The late Permian world was getting warmer, and as it got warmer, other feedback mechanisms kicked in that accelerated the warming further. As the oceans warmed, their capacity to hold dissolved oxygen decreased. Warmer water holds less oxygen than cooler water. This is basic chemistry, and it had profound implications for marine life. As oxygen levels in the ocean water fell, organisms that depended on that oxygen, which is to say, essentially all complex animal life in the ocean, experienced increasing physiological stress. In the deeper parts of the ocean, where oxygen was already relatively scarce because deep water is isolated from the surface where oxygen enters the water from the atmosphere, the decline in oxygen content was particularly severe, creating expanding zones of water so depleted of oxygen that most complex life could not survive in them. The warming ocean also affected the circulation patterns that distribute heat and nutrients around the global marine ecosystem. Cold, oxygen-rich water normally sinks in polar regions and flows along the bottom of the ocean toward the tropics, and warm surface water flows toward the poles to replace it. This great conveyor belt of ocean circulation is the mechanism by which the deep ocean is ventilated, by which nutrients concentrated in the deep water are periodically mixed up to the sunlit surface layers where phytoplankton can use them. As the climate warmed and the poles became less cold, this circulation began to slow and weaken. The deep ocean became more stagnant, the ventilation of the deep became less effective, the oxygen-depleted zones expanded. On land, the warming brought its own cascade of consequences. The seasonal patterns that had organized Pangean ecosystems for millions of years began to shift. Rainfall patterns changed as the temperature differential between the ocean and the continental interior changed. Some regions that had been relatively humid became drier. Some regions that had depended on a particular seasonal pattern of rainfall found that pattern disrupted. The plants, which could not move fast enough to track shifting climate zones, faced stress. And with the plants under stress, everything that depended on them began to feel the pressure too. The fossil record of the very latest Permian, the final few 100,000 years before the main extinction horizon, is one of the most intensively studied intervals of geological time, because it holds the key to understanding the sequence of events that led to the greatest mass extinction in the history of life. And what that record tells us, when read carefully and with full attention to its complexities, is a story of progressive biological deterioration that unfolded in stages. The earliest signals of something going wrong appear in the marine record, which is generally better preserved and more continuous than the terrestrial record. In marine sediments from the latest Permian, paleontologists see a progressive thinning of the diversity of certain groups of organisms, particularly the reef-building communities that had been so productive throughout the Permian. The calcareous sponges and bryozoans and brachiopods that had constructed the complex framework of Permian reefs began to decline in diversity and abundance. The reefs became less structurally complex, less productive, more simplified in their ecological organization. This reef decline was not instantaneous. It was gradual, playing out over hundreds of thousands of years, driven by the progressively changing ocean chemistry and temperature. The organisms building the reefs were sensitive to both water temperature and to the carbonate saturation state of the ocean, the degree to which the water was chemically favorable for the precipitation of the calcium carbonate that reef builders used to construct their skeletons. As the ocean warmed and its chemistry changed, carbonate saturation declined in some regions, making it physiologically harder for reef-building organisms to build and maintain their structures. As the reefs declined, the rich communities they had supported, the fish, the invertebrates, the predators, lost their physical and ecological foundation. Species diversity in reef-associated communities began to fall. The food webs that had depended on reef productivity became simpler, with fewer species at each trophic level and therefore less redundancy, less resilience in the face of further perturbation. On land, the early signals of deterioration were perhaps less dramatic but equally real. The composition of the plant communities in some regions began to change. Species that had been dominant gave ground to other species better able to tolerate the increasingly variable conditions. The productivity of some plant communities, the total amount of biomass produced per unit area per year, apparently declined, reducing the energy base available to the herbivore community. In the animal fossil record, the changes are visible as shifts in the relative abundance of different species within communities. Species that had been common became rarer. Species that had been rare sometimes became temporarily more abundant, filling the niches vacated by the declining dominant forms. The food webs were simplifying. The ecological redundancy, the presence of multiple species capable of filling each ecological role, providing a buffer against the loss of any single species, was being eroded. And through all of this early deterioration, the largest and most specialized animals faced the greatest pressure. This is a general rule in ecology. Specialists, with their narrow niches and their deep dependence on specific resources, are always more vulnerable than generalists when conditions change. A Gorgonopsian that had evolved specifically to hunt large Dicynodonts was in trouble if the large Dicynodont population declined. A reef specialist fish that could only survive in the complex physical structure of a functional reef was in trouble if the reef began to simplify and degrade. The Gorgonopsians, as the apex predators of the Late Permian, as the most specialized and ecologically specific of all the major vertebrate groups, were among the first to feel the consequences. Their populations, which had never been large by the standards of herbivore populations, apex predators are always numerically scarce relative to their prey, simply because the inefficiency of energy transfer through trophic levels means there is less energy available to support them, began to decline. Their geographic ranges, which had once spanned much of Pangea, began to contract. Local populations disappeared. The Dicynodonts, being more generalist in their dietary habits and more abundant in their populations, held on somewhat better in the early stages of the deterioration. But even they were not immune. As the vegetation changed and declined in some areas, as the seasonal patterns that organized their movements and their reproductive cycles were disrupted, as the water sources they depended on became less reliable, their populations too began to show signs of stress. The fossil record tells us that in the very latest Permian, just before the main extinction horizon, even the previously dominant and abundant Dicynodonts had lost significant diversity. Lineages that had been successful throughout most of the period were disappearing from the record. The variety of body sizes and ecological specializations that had characterized the Dicynodont radiation at its peak was contracting toward a smaller set of more generalist, more broadly adapted forms. The ecosystem was losing its complexity from the top and from the edges simultaneously. Apex predators declining, specialized forms disappearing, the middle and base of the food web still functioning, but with less diversity, less redundancy, less ecological depth than it had possessed at the peak of the Late Permian. It was like watching a magnificent building lose its upper floors while its foundations were slowly being undermined, still standing, still functional in a reduced way, but progressively less capable of withstanding further shock. The main extinction event, the event that paleontologists call the end Permian mass extinction, or the Permian-Triassic boundary event, was not instantaneous. The geological record suggests that it unfolded over a period of thousands to perhaps tens of thousands of years, which is an eye blink in geological time, but a long, terrible time for the organisms experiencing it. The most intense phase of extinction was rapid, possibly as brief as 60,000 years for the greatest losses, possibly somewhat longer, but the preceding deterioration had been building for much longer, and the recovery that followed would take much longer still. What happened at the peak of the extinction event, in that most intense phase of biological collapse, was a convergence of stresses that overwhelmed the coping capacity of even the most resilient organisms. The carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, elevated by millions of years of Siberian Traps volcanism, reached levels that drove global average temperatures to extremes not seen since the very different conditions of much earlier geological periods. Some estimates suggest that the global average temperature during the end Permian crisis rose by as much as 10 degrees Celsius, an extraordinary change that occurred far faster than organisms could adapt to through evolutionary processes. The consequences of that warming cascaded through every level of the biosphere simultaneously. In the ocean, the combined effects of warming, oxygen depletion, and ocean acidification, the acidification caused by the absorption of elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide into seawater, which forms carbonic acid and lowers the pH of the water, created conditions that were lethal to most marine organisms. The reef communities, already weakened by years of deteriorating conditions, collapsed entirely. The reefs of the Permian, those complex, productive, biologically rich structures that had taken millions of years to build, dissolved and disintegrated as the water around them turned chemically hostile to the organisms that had built them. The ocean acidification was particularly devastating because it struck at the base of the food web as well as the reef communities. Many of the phytoplankton species that formed the foundation of marine food webs built their tiny shells from calcium carbonate, and in an acidifying ocean, those shells dissolved. As the phytoplankton declined, the entire edifice of the marine food web that depended on them was undermined. Zooplankton that fed on phytoplankton declined. Fish that fed on zooplankton declined. Sharks and other apex predators that fed on fish declined. From top to bottom, from the smallest to the largest, the marine ecosystem was failing simultaneously at every level. The oxygen-depleted zones in the ocean expanded to cover areas that had previously been habitable. Deep water communities that had been relatively isolated from the changes in surface conditions were smothered as the stagnating water around them lost the last of its oxygen. The bottom sediments, instead of hosting the diverse communities of burrowing invertebrates that are such an important part of marine ecosystem function, became barren muds where only the most oxygen-tolerant microbial communities could survive. In the most extreme conditions of the end Permian Ocean, something extraordinary and sinister happened. Bacteria capable of producing hydrogen sulfide, a highly toxic gas, thrived in the oxygen-depleted deep water where they faced no competition from aerobic life. As their populations grew and their metabolism produced hydrogen sulfide in increasing quantities, the gas began to diffuse upward from the deep water toward the surface. In some regions, hydrogen sulfide may have reached high enough concentrations to be genuinely toxic to surface-dwelling marine life. And in some models of the end Permian crisis, hydrogen sulfide even outgassed from the ocean's surface into the atmosphere, adding another toxic stress to the already catastrophically altered atmospheric chemistry. On land, the story was simultaneously playing out with equal devastation. The extreme warming, particularly in the already hot interior regions of Pangea, pushed temperatures in some areas beyond the physiological limits of most complex life. The concept of a lethal isotherm, a line on the map beyond which temperatures are simply too high for complex animal life to survive, was apparently crossed in equatorial and low-latitude regions during the most intense phase of the end Permian crisis. Animals in these regions faced temperatures that exceeded the upper limits of their thermal tolerance for extended periods, causing massive mortality regardless of food supply, water availability, or any other factor. The vegetation in many regions collapsed. Plant communities that had persisted for millions of years were destroyed by the combination of rising temperatures, shifting rainfall patterns, and the direct toxic effects of the elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide and associated acid rainfall acidified by the sulfur dioxide emissions of the ongoing volcanism. In some fossil records from the end Permian boundary, paleobotanists find a dramatic change in the pattern of spores and pollen preserved in the sediment, a sudden disappearance of the diverse assemblage of plant species that had characterized the late Permian flora, replaced by a simpler assemblage dominated by the most stress-tolerant opportunistic plants and by an abundance of fungal spores that suggests widespread plant death and decomposition. This plant die-off, sometimes called the fungal spike event, for the striking increase in fungal spores in the latest Permian sediments was not merely a vegetative disaster. It was the destruction of the foundation of the entire terrestrial food web. When the plants died, the herbivores lost their food base. When the herbivores declined, the predators lost theirs. The entire terrestrial ecosystem was being destabilized simultaneously at every level, just as the marine ecosystem was. The large herbivores, the Dicynodonts, the Dinosaurs, faced starvation as the vegetation they depended on disappeared or became inadequate. Animals that had maintained their populations through the earlier phase of deterioration by virtue of their dietary breadth and adaptability now found that even broad dietary adaptability could not save them when there was simply not enough vegetation of any kind to sustain their energy needs. Populations crashed. Species that had been abundant throughout the Permian disappeared from the fossil record one by one. The predators, already reduced in the earlier phase of deterioration, were hit by the collapse of their prey populations at the same time as they were dealing with the direct physiological stress of the altered climate. A Gorgonopsian needed to eat large prey animals regularly to maintain its elevated metabolic rate. As large prey animals became scarce, as the herds of Dicynodonts shrank and fragmented and eventually disappeared from region after region, the Gorgonopsians found themselves in an impossible situation. Too specialized to switch to different prey, too metabolically demanding to survive on reduced rations for long, too reduced in population already to sustain the reproductive rates needed to replace their losses. The Gorgonopsians, those magnificent apex predators who had dominated the late Permian terrestrial world for millions of years, who had evolved some of the most impressive killing machinery that any land predator has ever possessed, who had shaped the ecology of the Permian world through their predatory pressure on the herbivore community. The Gorgonopsians did not survive the end Permian extinction. Not a single lineage of Gorgonopsian made it through. They went extinct completely, utterly, without descendant. The last of them died somewhere on the changing Pangean landscape, and when it died, it took with it everything its lineage had been and everything it might have become. They were not alone in their total extinction. Many of the other major groups of the Permian world met the same fate. The Dinosaurs vanished. The vast majority of Dicynodont diversity was lost, though a small number of lineages would persist into the early Triassic as relic survivors, diminished shadows of the group's former richness. The diverse therapsid predator community, the Therosphalians, the various other carnivorous therapsid lineages, was catastrophically reduced. The rich communities of marine invertebrates that had built the Permian reefs were essentially annihilated. The numbers, when paleontologists have worked through the fossil record with the tools of quantitative analysis, are staggering. The end Permian mass extinction eliminated somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species. On land, the losses were somewhat less severe in percentage terms, perhaps 70 to 80% of terrestrial species, but the impact on ecological structure and function was equally profound because the losses were not random. They were concentrated among the most ecologically central and most specialized organisms, the ones whose disappearance most fundamentally disrupted the functioning of the ecosystems they had been part of. What remained when the worst was over was not a world, it was the wreckage of a world. A planet that had supported, just thousands of years before, the most complex and diverse array of life in its history to that point, now reduced to a skeleton of survivors, a remnant biota that had only marginally escaped the fate of the vast majority of its contemporaries, and that now faced the task of rebuilding something from almost nothing. Let us talk about the survivors. Because the story of the end Permian extinction is not only a story of what was lost, though that story deserves to be told with full honesty about the scale of the loss. It is also a story of what persisted, of the organisms that found their way through the catastrophe, and of what their survival meant for the long future of life on this planet. The survivors of the end Permian extinction were, as a general rule, distinguished by characteristics that gave them greater flexibility in the face of the novel and extreme conditions of the extinction crisis. They were, broadly speaking, smaller, more generalist in their diets and their ecological requirements, more tolerant of a wide range of physical and chemical conditions, less dependent on the specific ecological structures and relationships, the reefs, the complex food webs, the particular vegetation types that had been destroyed. On land, the survivors among the Synapsids were not the magnificent, large-bodied forms that had defined the late Permian world. They were not the Gorgonopsians or the large Dicynodonts or the Dinosaurs. They were the smaller, less conspicuous, more ecologically flexible members of the Synapsid radiation, animals that had perhaps lived in the ecological margins of the Permian world, not dominant players but persistent ones, their smaller size and broader diets and greater physiological tolerance giving them the flexibility to find food and water and shelter in a world whose ecological structure had been largely destroyed. Among these survivors were some of the lineages that would prove most consequential for the future. The Dicynodonts, a group of Synapsids that had been present throughout the Permian but had not been dominant players in the late Permian ecosystem, survived the extinction in small numbers, and the Dicynodonts were, in the deep genealogical sense, the ancestors of all mammals. The lineage that would eventually give rise to the monotremes and the marsupials and the placentals, to every mammal living today, including every human being, survived the end Permian extinction as a small, perhaps shrew-like or weasel-like creature living in the margins, eating whatever it could find, enduring conditions that had killed the great majority of its contemporaries. There is something almost unbearably moving about this fact. The lineage that would one day produce whales and bats and elephants and human beings survived the greatest catastrophe in the history of life not as something magnificent and dominant, not as the apex of an established order, but as a survivor in the most literal and unadorned sense, an organism that simply did not die when almost everything around it did, because it happened to have the right combination of characteristics, the right size, the right dietary flexibility, the right physiological tolerance to endure conditions that were lethal to almost everyone else. The early Triassic world that these survivors inherited was a world almost unimaginably impoverished compared to the late Permian that had preceded it. The fossil record of the earliest Triassic, the period immediately following the end Permian extinction, is remarkable for its poverty. Where the late Permian fossil record shows rich, diverse communities with many species interacting in complex food webs, the earliest Triassic record shows something that paleontologists sometimes call disaster faunas, communities composed of a very small number of highly abundant, broadly tolerant species, living in an ecological world of radical simplicity. On land, one of the most striking features of the earliest Triassic recovery is the dominance of a single genus of Dicynodont, Lystrosaurus, in many regions. Lystrosaurus was not the largest or the most ecologically sophisticated of the late Permian Dicynodonts. It was a medium-sized, generalist herbivore with a particularly broad tolerance for variable conditions and a dietary flexibility that allowed it to make use of whatever vegetation was available. And in the devastated aftermath of the extinction, it thrived, filling the herbivore niche across vast areas of the recovering terrestrial world with a monotonous abundance that speaks volumes about the ecological emptiness of the world it was living in. The dominance of Lystrosaurus in the earliest Triassic is sometimes held up as an example of ecological recovery. In one sense, it is at least the herbivore niche was being filled, at least energy was flowing through the terrestrial food web again. But in a deeper sense, the Lystrosaurus world was not recovery. It was the most basic possible functioning of a surviving system, a system stripped of its complexity, its redundancy, its ecological richness, running on the minimum viable set of ecological relationships rather than the elaborate, interlocking web of the late Permian. True recovery, the rebuilding of ecological complexity, the re-diversification of the surviving lineages into new forms filling new niches, the re-establishment of food webs with multiple trophic levels and multiple species at each level. That process took far longer, and it was far from straightforward. The early Triassic period, the roughly 5 million years that followed the end Permian extinction, was a time of continuing environmental stress in many regions. The volcanic activity of the Siberian Traps had not immediately ceased at the extinction horizon. It continued, though perhaps at reduced intensity, for some time into the early Triassic. The elevated carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere persisted. The ocean remained warm and oxygen depleted and chemically hostile to many forms of life. The terrestrial climate was still extreme, still unpredictable, still operating far outside the boundaries of the rhythmic, predictable Permian world that the ancestors of the surviving organisms had been shaped by. Under these continuing stresses, recovery was slow and uneven. Some groups that had survived the extinction began to diversify cautiously into the ecological spaces left vacant by the mass extinction. Others remained reduced for millions of years, their populations too small and their environments too hostile for significant diversification to proceed. The marine record shows this extended period of recovery particularly clearly. For several million years after the extinction horizon, marine diversity remained at catastrophically low levels. The reefs did not rebuild. The complex invertebrate communities of the Permian Ocean did not reform. Instead, the early Triassic Ocean was dominated by a few stress-tolerant groups, certain bivalve mollusks, certain microbial communities that could tolerate the degraded chemical and physical conditions of the post-extinction ocean. The ecological complexity of the Permian marine world would not be approached again for millions of years. On land, the recovery was similarly protracted. The small survivors of the extinction, the small-bodied Synapsids, the early archosaurs, the surviving amphibians, lived in a world of ecological opportunity and ecological poverty simultaneously. The opportunity was real. The extinction had cleared away the vast majority of the large, dominant species that had organized the late Permian ecosystem, leaving enormous ecological space that was, in principle, available for colonization by new forms. The poverty was equally real. In a world with devastated plant communities, with simplified food webs, with reduced primary productivity, there was simply not enough energy flowing through the system to support the rapid diversification and body size increase that might otherwise have been expected. The result was a recovery that proceeded fitfully, with setbacks and advances, driven by the slow restoration of environmental conditions toward something more habitable and the gradual diversification of the surviving lineages into new ecological roles. And here, in this story of recovery, one of the most consequential and most surprising stories of all of Earth's history begins to unfold. Because the world that recovered from the end Permian extinction was not a simple restoration of the world that had been destroyed. It was something genuinely new. The extinction had not merely reduced the Permian world. It had reshuffled the ecological deck, eliminated the previously dominant players, and created conditions in which lineages that had been subordinate in the Permian world had the opportunity to rise to dominance. The archosaurs, the lineage that would give rise to dinosaurs, crocodilians, and eventually birds, had been present in the late Permian, but they had been minor players in an ecosystem still thoroughly dominated by the therapsid synapsids. The Gorgonopsians had been in charge. The Dicynodonts had been the dominant herbivores. The archosaurs had filled subsidiary roles, present but not ascendant. The end Permian extinction changed everything. With the Gorgonopsians gone, with the dominant therapsid herbivores devastated, with the ecological landscape cleared of the previously dominant forms, the archosaurs found themselves in a world that was, for the first time, open to them. And they responded to that openness with a diversification of extraordinary speed and creativity. By geological standards, that would ultimately produce, in the Triassic and then the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, the dinosaurs that have so captured the modern imagination. This, then, is one of the deep ironies of the end Permian extinction. The catastrophe that destroyed the Permian world, that killed the Gorgonopsians and devastated the Dicynodonts and eliminated the Dinosaurs and collapsed the magnificent reefs of Panthalassa, that same catastrophe created the conditions for the rise of dinosaurs. The most famous and beloved of all prehistoric creatures owed their eventual dominance to the most devastating extinction event in the history of life. Without the end Permian crisis, the therapsid synapsids would almost certainly have continued to dominate the terrestrial world. The archosaurs would have remained in their subordinate roles. Dinosaurs, in the form we know them, would probably never have arisen at all. And by extension, and this is where the story takes its deepest and most personal turn, without the end Permian extinction, mammals would almost certainly not exist as a major force in Earth's biology. The small cynodont therapsids that survived the extinction would have had no opportunity to diversify into the enormous range of forms that mammals eventually occupied. They would have remained small and marginal, overshadowed by the continued dominance of the larger therapsid lineages. The extinction that was so catastrophic for the Permian world was, in the deepest sense, the event that made the eventual existence of mammals, and therefore of us, possible. This is not a comfortable thought. It does not reduce the horror of what was lost, but it is a true thought, and it is important to hold both of these truths simultaneously. That the end Permian extinction was the greatest biological catastrophe in the history of life, destroying something of extraordinary and irreplaceable value, and that its consequences, unfolding over hundreds of millions of years, eventually produced the world we inhabit today, including ourselves. The recovery of life after the end Permian extinction was not merely a story of who came back. It was a story of how ecosystems are rebuilt from scratch, how complexity re-emerges from simplicity, how diversity re-emerges from poverty, how the intricate webs of ecological relationship that organize a functioning biosphere are re-woven after they have been torn apart. Ecologists who study modern ecosystem recovery, the return of vegetation and animal communities to areas devastated by fire, flood, volcanic eruption, or other disturbances, have developed a conceptual framework for thinking about this process that applies with remarkable precision to the recovery after the end Permian extinction, even though the scale and duration are vastly different. Recovery proceeds in stages, and the early stages are dominated by generalists, organisms that can tolerate a wide range of conditions, that can exploit a wide range of resources, and that can establish themselves in the disturbed, simplified environment left behind after the disturbance. These pioneer species are the first movers, the organisms that begin the work of rebuilding ecological structure where none exists. They are not typically the most complex or the most specialized organisms. They are the most robust, the most flexible, the most opportunistic. In the marine realm, the pioneer organisms after the end Permian extinction included certain bivalve mollusks, clams, and their relatives that were tolerant of low oxygen, chemically variable conditions and could exploit the disturbed, organic-rich sediments of the post-extinction seafloor. They also included microbial mats, communities of photosynthetic and chemosynthetic bacteria that can colonize bare rock and sediment and begin the process of building biological structure even in the most hostile conditions. These microbial communities, which had been less prominent in the well-oxygenated, ecologically complex Permian Ocean, where they were outcompeted by more sophisticated organisms, suddenly found themselves in a world where their stress tolerance made them the dominant form of life across large areas. On land, the pioneer organisms were the fast-reproducing, broadly tolerant plants, ferns, and their relatives, which can colonize bare or disturbed ground rapidly, their spores dispersing widely and germinating under a broad range of conditions. The fern spike that is visible in many earliest Triassic sedimentary records, an abundance of fern spores in the sediment immediately following the extinction horizon, represents the colonization of the devastated Pangean landscape by these pioneer plants, beginning the slow work of rebuilding the plant communities that would eventually support the animal life that followed. As the pioneer communities established themselves and began to modify the environment, stabilizing soil, adding organic matter, creating shade that reduced the thermal extremes at ground level, conditions improved sufficiently for the next wave of colonizers, slightly more specialized organisms that required somewhat more favorable conditions, but that could exploit the more structured environment created by the pioneers. These in turn modified the environment further, creating conditions for yet more specialized organisms, and so on through a succession of increasingly complex communities that gradually rebuilt something approaching the ecological richness that had been lost. This process, ecological succession, as it is known, is slow under the best of circumstances. After the end Permian extinction, under the continuing stress of an altered climate and degraded ocean chemistry, it was extraordinarily slow. The most credible estimates from the paleontological record suggest that the recovery of anything approaching Permian-level ecological complexity, particularly in the marine realm, took somewhere between 5 and 10 million years. Some groups, particularly the reef-building communities of the ocean, took even longer, with fully complex reef ecosystems not reappearing in the fossil record until the middle of the Triassic period, some 10 to 15 million years after the extinction. On land, the recovery of complex, multi-species ecosystems also proceeded over millions of years. The early Triassic terrestrial world was dominated by the Lystrosaurus fauna, simple, species-poor communities centered on this single abundant herbivore, for perhaps 5 to 8 million years before significant diversification began to produce communities with more species, more trophic levels, and more ecological complexity. And even then, the recovery was not a simple linear progression toward restored complexity. It had setbacks. It had intervals of renewed environmental stress. There were additional volcanic events in the early Triassic, additional perturbations of the climate and ocean chemistry that slowed or temporarily reversed the process of recovery. The rebuilding of ecological complexity after the end Permian extinction was driven, ultimately, by evolution. By the process of random genetic variation and natural selection working on the populations of surviving organisms, producing, over millions of generations, new forms adapted to the new ecological opportunities of the post-extinction world. This evolutionary diversification after a mass extinction, what biologists call an adaptive radiation, is one of the most creative and consequential processes in the history of life. When a mass extinction eliminates the previously dominant forms and opens up ecological space, the surviving lineages face a world of opportunity. Niches that had been occupied by the extinct forms are now vacant, and there is intense selection pressure on the survivors to diversify into those vacated niches. The organisms that diversify into vacated niches do not do so by design or intention. They do so through the blind, patient work of evolution, random mutations generating new variants, natural selection favoring those variants that happen to perform better in the available ecological roles, populations diverging over generations and millennia into new forms adapted to new ways of life. It is a process that cannot be hurried, it cannot be directed. It operates on timescales of thousands to millions of years, too slow for any individual organism to perceive, but relentless and cumulative in its effects over geological time. The adaptive radiation of the archosaurs after the end Permian extinction is one of the most spectacular examples of this process in the fossil record. From the small, somewhat obscure archosaur lineages that survived the extinction, there emerged, over the course of the Triassic period, an extraordinary diversity of forms. Some archosaurs became large-bodied terrestrial predators, filling the ecological roles that the Gorgonopsians had vacated. Some became herbivores, some became semi-aquatic. Some became small and fast and eventually developed the anatomical features, the bipedal posture, the reduced forelimbs, the particular configuration of the ankle that would characterize the true dinosaurs that appeared in the Middle Triassic. The first true dinosaurs were not spectacular beasts. They were modest creatures, bipedal, generally small to medium-sized, living in what appear to have been relatively arid, seasonal environments. But they were the beginning of something that would become, over the course of the next 150 million years, the most spectacular radiation of large-bodied terrestrial vertebrates in Earth's history. The dinosaurs, from the diminutive beginnings of their Triassic ancestors to the staggering giants of the Jurassic and the extraordinary diversity of the Cretaceous, were in the most fundamental sense children of the end Permian extinction. They existed because that catastrophe had cleared the way for them. Meanwhile, the cynodont therapsids, the ancestors of mammals, were also diversifying, though more slowly and less spectacularly in the early going. In the shadow of the archosaur radiation, the cynodonts were pursuing their own evolutionary trajectory, gradually refining the physiological and anatomical characteristics that would eventually produce the first true mammals. The improvement of the jaw mechanics, the progressive elaboration of the hearing apparatus, the development of the secondary palate that separated the breathing passage from the food passage and allowed breathing and chewing to happen simultaneously, the evolution of warm-bloodedness and insulating fur, all of these mammalian characteristics were developing gradually within the cynodont lineage over the course of the Triassic and into the earliest Jurassic period. The first true mammals appeared in the fossil record in the late Triassic, roughly 225 to 210 million years ago, somewhere between 30 and 40 million years after the end Permian extinction. They were small animals, probably nocturnal, feeding on insects and other small prey, living in a world still dominated by the dinosaurs that had diversified so spectacularly from the archosaur lineage. In many ways, the earliest mammals were remarkably reminiscent of the small, marginal survivors of the end Permian extinction, small, flexible, broadly adapted, living in the ecological margins of a world where the large dominant forms were something else entirely. They would remain in that marginal, small-bodied, nocturnal condition for nearly another 160 million years, throughout the entire dominance of the dinosaurs, until another catastrophic extinction, the end Cretaceous impact event 66 million years ago, cleared the ecological landscape again and gave the mammals their opportunity to diversify into the dominant large-bodied forms of the modern world. But let us step back from the long sweep of evolutionary history and return to the specific story of the recovery from the end Permian extinction. Because the rebuilding of ecosystems after this catastrophe was not merely a matter of evolution producing new forms to fill old niches. It was a profoundly geographical story, a story of how surviving populations in different regions of Pangea responded to the changed conditions, how they expanded their ranges as conditions improved, and how they eventually met and interacted with each other in ways that shaped the character of the recovering world. The geography of survival had been partly determined by the geography of the extinction itself. The extinction crisis had not been uniformly severe across all regions of Pangea and Panthalassa. Some areas had been more severely affected than others, depending on local conditions of temperature, ocean chemistry, vegetation type, and a host of other factors. Some areas had experienced more rapid and more extreme changes. Others had been somewhat buffered, perhaps by local oceanographic features that maintained slightly more tolerable conditions, or by topographic features on land that created cooler or moister refugia in the midst of a generally deteriorating landscape. In these relatively buffered areas, refugia, In the biological sense, populations of organisms that would otherwise have gone extinct were able to persist. Their numbers were reduced, sometimes drastically, and the ecological communities they formed were simplified and impoverished compared to their pre-extinction equivalents. But they survived. And their survival meant that when conditions eventually improved, when the volcanism of the Siberian Traps finally ceased, when the elevated carbon dioxide began to be slowly drawn down through the weathering of silicate rocks, when the ocean chemistry gradually recovered, when the terrestrial climate slowly returned to something more like its Permian rhythms, there were populations available to expand, to diversify, to recolonize the enormous areas that had been emptied of complex life. The recolonization of devastated areas from surviving refugia is a process we can observe at much smaller scales in the modern world. The recovery of life on the island of Krakatoa after its catastrophic volcanic eruption in the 19th century, for example, or the recolonization of the area around the Mount St. Helens eruption. In these modern cases, recovery proceeds through the dispersal of organisms from surrounding unaffected areas, and the rate of recovery depends on the size and diversity of the source populations, the distance of dispersal, and the suitability of the recovering habitat for the colonizing organisms. After the end Permian extinction, the scales were vastly larger. We are talking about recolonization of regions spanning thousands of kilometers from refugia that might have been separated from the devastated areas by significant barriers of unsuitable habitat. And the distances that spores and seeds and animals had to travel to recolonize emptied regions were, in some cases, vast by any biological standard. But the fundamental dynamics were the same: survival in refugia, followed by gradual expansion as conditions improved, followed by mixing of previously isolated populations as expanding ranges encountered each other, followed by the ecological and evolutionary interactions that arise when diverse groups of organisms begin to share space. The mixing of populations from different refugia was itself an evolutionary event of significance. When previously isolated populations of the same species encounter each other, they can exchange genetic material, potentially combining adaptations that had evolved independently in different environments and producing new genotypes of greater biological breadth. When previously isolated populations of different species encounter each other after long periods of separation, they bring with them the ecological relationships, predator-prey, competitor-mutualist, that had developed in their separate refugia, and the meshing of these different ecological relationship networks created new and sometimes unexpected dynamics in the recovering communities. The ocean recovery had its own geography and its own dynamics, distinct from but parallel to the terrestrial recovery. The marine refugia of the end Permian crisis were the areas of the global ocean where conditions had remained most tolerable. Regions of cooler, better oxygenated, less acidified water, often at higher latitudes where the extreme warming of the tropics was somewhat moderated, or in areas of local upwelling where cool, nutrient-rich deep water brought relatively fresh oxygen to the surface. From these marine refugia, the surviving lineages of fish, invertebrates, and other marine organisms gradually expanded their ranges as ocean conditions improved. The recovery of marine ecosystems proceeded through a succession of stages analogous to the terrestrial succession: pioneer communities of stress-tolerant generalists, followed by progressively more diverse and specialized communities, culminating eventually in the restoration of complex, multi-species assemblages with multiple trophic levels and significant ecological redundancy. The return of complex reef ecosystems was one of the most ecologically significant milestones of the post-Permian marine recovery, though it was also one of the slowest. The Permian reefs, with their framework of calcareous sponges and bryozoans and brachiopods, did not come back. Those particular reef-building organisms had been too severely reduced by the extinction and the changed ocean conditions to re-establish their former role. Instead, the reefs that eventually rebuilt in the Middle and Late Triassic were constructed by a different set of organisms, particularly the scleractinian corals, a group that had been relatively minor or possibly absent from the Permian reef community, but that diversified dramatically in the post-extinction world and became the primary reef builders of the modern ocean. This replacement of one reef-building community by a completely different reef-building community, producing functionally similar but taxonomically distinct reef ecosystems, is one of the most striking examples of ecological convergence in the fossil record. The reef as an ecological structure, a complex, physically three-dimensional, highly productive, species-rich community organized around a framework of calcium carbonate, turned out to be such a successful ecological solution that life reinvented it after the Permian extinction using a completely different set of building blocks. The function was preserved even as the organisms performing that function were entirely replaced. This pattern of ecological function being preserved through the replacement of one set of organisms by another with different taxonomy but similar ecological role is a recurring theme in the post-Permian recovery. Apex predators were replaced by different apex predators. Large herbivores were replaced by different large herbivores. Filter feeders were replaced by different filter feeders. The ecological architecture of the biosphere, the basic structure of who eats whom and how energy flows through the system, was rebuilt using new materials, new species, new lineages that had diversified to fill the roles left vacant by the extinct forms. This is one of the deepest lessons that the end Permian extinction and its aftermath teaches us about the nature of ecosystems. The particular species that fill ecological roles are, in one sense, replaceable. Evolution will, given enough time, produce organisms capable of filling any ecological role that offers sufficient resources to sustain a population. But the ecological roles themselves, the fundamental structure of how energy flows through biological systems, are extraordinarily robust and conservative. The same basic trophic architecture, primary producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, apex predators, decomposers, has characterized virtually every complex ecosystem in the history of life, regardless of which particular species were filling each role. The Permian world had its own version of that architecture, elaborated to extraordinary complexity over millions of years. The extinction demolished the specific organisms that had filled each role. But the architecture itself, the framework of ecological function, was rebuilt by the survivors and their descendants in new forms over the millions of years of the Triassic recovery. The world that emerged from the Triassic was not the Permian world. But it was recognizably a world, organized on the same fundamental ecological principles, functioning according to the same deep logic of energy flow and trophic interaction that had characterized every complex biosphere in the history of life. There is a question that has haunted the study of the end Permian extinction from the very beginning, and it is not a purely scientific question. It is a question that touches on something deeper, something that brings the story of the Permian world into direct conversation with the world we inhabit today. The question is this: why does it matter? Why should we care about the fate of Gorgonopsians and Dicynodonts and Permian reef communities that lived and died 250 million years before we were born? What does the end Permian extinction have to say to us beyond the purely academic interest of understanding a chapter of geological history? The answer has several dimensions, and each of them is worth considering carefully. The first dimension is simply the matter of scientific understanding. We live on a planet with a 4.5 billion year history of life, and that history is not irrelevant to the present. The organisms alive today are the products of that history. The ecosystems we inhabit are built on foundations laid down by billions of years of ecological and evolutionary process. Understanding the major disruptions to that history, the mass extinctions that periodically reset the trajectory of life on Earth, is essential to understanding how the modern biosphere came to be the way it is. The end Permian extinction is the largest of those disruptions, and studying it gives us insight into the processes of extinction, survival, and recovery that are fundamental to understanding life's history on this planet. The second dimension is more specific to the evolutionary story. The end Permian extinction was the event that created the conditions for the rise of dinosaurs and ultimately for the rise of mammals. It shaped the trajectory of vertebrate evolution in ways that cascade all the way forward to the present, including to ourselves. Understanding the end Permian extinction is, in a very real sense, understanding a pivotal chapter in our own deep history, the history of the lineage of life that includes us. The third dimension is perhaps the most challenging to articulate, but also the most important. The end Permian extinction was caused primarily by massive additions of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere from volcanic sources, and the consequences of that addition, warming, ocean acidification, oxygen depletion, ecosystem collapse, followed from the altered atmospheric chemistry through a chain of physical and chemical and biological processes that are well understood by modern science. The physics and chemistry of greenhouse gases. The relationship between atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration and global temperature. The sensitivity of carbonate chemistry to ocean pH. These are not mysterious processes peculiar to the Permian. They are the same processes operating in the same ways in the same ocean and the same atmosphere that exist today. The Permian world and the world we inhabit are not separated by some unbridgeable gulf of different physical laws or different chemical processes. They are separated only by time. The Permian Ocean responded to elevated carbon dioxide in the way that oceans respond to elevated carbon dioxide, the same way that the modern ocean is responding to elevated carbon dioxide today. The Permian climate responded to increased greenhouse gas concentrations in the way that climates respond to increased greenhouse gas concentrations. The ecosystems of the late Permian were vulnerable to rapid climate change in the way that ecosystems are vulnerable to rapid climate change, because evolution, which is the only mechanism by which living systems can adapt to changed conditions, operates on timescales of thousands to millions of years, not on the timescales of decades or centuries over which climate change operates. None of this is to say that the modern world is on the verge of a repeat of the end Permian extinction. The situations are different in important ways. The rate of change, the absolute magnitudes, the specific organisms involved, the ecological context, all of these differ between the end Permian crisis and any modern situation. But the end Permian extinction demonstrates, with all the authority of the geological record, that the relationship between atmospheric chemistry, climate, and biological systems is real and consequential and capable of producing outcomes of catastrophic magnitude. It demonstrates that complex ecosystems, for all their resilience, have limits, that sufficiently rapid and severe disruption of the physical and chemical conditions they depend on can exceed their capacity for response and recovery. And it demonstrates that when those limits are exceeded, the losses can be vast and the recovery can take millions of years. The late Permian world, in all its magnificence and complexity, is a reminder of what biological systems are capable of building over time. The end Permian extinction is a reminder of what it takes to destroy what life has built. And the long, slow, patient recovery of the post-Permian world is a reminder of what it takes to rebuild, of the timescales involved, of the irreversibility of specific losses even within the context of eventual ecological recovery, and of the extraordinary creative capacity of life when given the time and the conditions it needs. Let us return at last to the survivors themselves. Let us follow the thread of their story forward from the devastated earliest Triassic world and watch, in broad strokes, the long arc of recovery that eventually produced the biological richness of the Triassic and Jurassic and Cretaceous worlds, and ultimately the world we know today. The first few million years after the extinction were, as we have seen, a time of great simplicity and great stress. Lystrosaurus and its relatives dominated the land. The oceans were recovering slowly from their near-total ecological collapse. The climate was still extreme, still varying in ways that tested the surviving organisms continuously. But life is stubborn, life is persistent. Life has a quality, not consciousness, not intention, but a quality that emerges from the relentless pressure of natural selection on populations of organisms, of finding ways, of filling available space, of exploiting available resources, of producing, through the patient machinery of variation and selection, organisms suited to conditions that might seem to offer nothing but difficulty. In the Middle Triassic, roughly 240 million years ago, roughly 10 million years after the end Permian extinction, the fossil record begins to show something that had been absent since before the catastrophe: genuine ecological diversity, multiple species at multiple trophic levels. Predators of different sizes targeting different prey, herbivores of different body sizes exploiting different vegetation resources. The food webs were becoming more complex, the ecosystems were gaining depth and redundancy, life was healing. The archosaurs were by this time well into their adaptive radiation, the early dinosaurs were appearing. The crocodile lineage, the archosaur branch that would eventually give rise to modern crocodilians, was diversifying into a remarkable range of forms, some of them terrestrial predators that looked superficially more like bipedal dinosaurs than like the semi-aquatic ambush predators we associate with modern crocodilians. The flying reptiles, the pterosaurs, another archosaur lineage, were beginning their own remarkable radiation into the aerial niche that no large vertebrate had previously occupied. And in the ecological margins of this increasingly dynamic world, the Synapsids were quietly doing the evolutionary work that would eventually produce the mammals. Their teeth were becoming more complex. Their jaw joints were changing in ways that would eventually complete the transformation of the reptilian jaw bones into the mammalian middle ear bones, one of the most remarkable anatomical transformations in evolutionary history, a transformation that is beautifully documented in the fossil record. Their brains were apparently growing in relative size. Their metabolisms were increasing. And their ecological roles were diversifying as the recovering world offered new opportunities for small, active, insectivorous animals. The late Triassic world, 220 to 210 million years ago, was a very different place from the late Permian world with which our story began. The organisms were different, the great Therapsid lineages of the Permian reduced to small survivors, replaced in ecological dominance by the archosaurs and their increasingly dramatic diversity of forms. The plants were different, the flora was evolving, with new groups of conifers becoming more prominent, with the first cycads and other gymnosperm groups diversifying. The climate was different, still warm and seasonal, still operating in the context of Pangea, but with Pangea itself beginning slowly to fracture along the fault lines that would eventually separate it into the continents we know today. And yet in the deep structure of the ecosystems, in the fundamental logic of how energy flowed and how species interacted and how ecological communities were organized, there was a continuity with the Permian world. The basic principles were the same. The ecological architecture was the same. Life had rebuilt itself on the same foundations, using new materials, and was doing what life always does, filling available space, processing available energy, diversifying into available niches, and building, layer by patient layer, the ecological complexity that makes a biosphere rather than a collection of isolated organisms. The Jurassic world, the world of 170 to 140 million years ago, was when the recovery from the end Permian extinction reached its fullest expression in terms of the organisms most people know about. This was the age of the great dinosaurs. The sauropods, those enormous, long-necked, long-tailed, spectacularly large herbivores, had diversified into the dominant large herbivore role that the Dicynodonts had occupied in the Permian, though they occupied it on a scale of body size that the Dicynodonts had never approached. The largest sauropods were the largest land animals in the history of life, animals of 50, 80, perhaps 100 metric tons, their sheer size a biological statement of extraordinary audacity. The large theropod dinosaurs, the great predators from Allosaurus to later Tyrannosaurus, occupied the apex predator role that the Gorgonopsians had held in the Permian, with a very different anatomy but a similar ecological function. Large, powerful, highly specialized hunters that kept the herbivore populations in check and drove the behavioral evolution of their prey through the relentless pressure of predation. These were the inheritors of the Permian world's ecological roles. They were not continuations of the Permian lineages, they were replacements, products of the great Archosaur radiation that had been unleashed by the end Permian extinction. But they were doing the same fundamental things that the Gorgonopsians and the Dicynodonts and the Pariasaurs had done, fixing the sun's energy through plant consumption, transferring that energy up through trophic levels to support predator populations, shaping landscapes through their feeding and their movement, driving evolutionary change through their ecological interactions. And living in the ecological margins of this dinosaur world, small and overlooked and nocturnal, the mammals were waiting, developing, evolving, quietly building the physiological and neurological complexity that would one day, when opportunity struck, allow them to diversify with extraordinary speed into the dominant large-bodied fauna of the modern world. The mammals of the Jurassic and Cretaceous were, for the most part, small, mouse-sized to rat-sized, a few reaching cat-sized or so, but they were not evolutionarily stagnant. The fossil record of Mesozoic mammals, which has been enormously enriched by spectacular discoveries in China and other parts of the world over the past few decades, shows a fauna of considerable diversity, with different lineages exploiting different ecological roles: insectivores, seed-eaters, possibly some fish-eating specialists, even some that appear to have been climbing specialists in trees. The mammals were diversifying throughout the Mesozoic, building the biological toolkit that would eventually serve them so well when the dinosaurs were gone. The end of the dinosaurs' dominance, the end Cretaceous mass extinction 66 million years ago, caused by the impact of a large asteroid near what is now the coast of Mexico, falls outside the scope of our story today. But it is worth noting in closing that the pattern it exemplifies is the same pattern we have been tracing throughout this account. A catastrophic disruption of the established ecological order, the elimination of previously dominant forms, the opening of ecological space, the rapid diversification of surviving lineages into the vacated niches, the rebuilding of ecological complexity over millions of years, and the emergence from that rebuilding of a biosphere different from what came before but organized on the same fundamental ecological principles. The world we inhabit today is, in the deepest sense, the product of these repeated cycles of destruction and rebuilding. Every mass extinction in Earth's history, and there have been 5 that are recognized as truly major events, of which the end Permian is the largest cleared ecological space, and allowed new evolutionary experiments that might never have been possible in the presence of the previously established dominant forms. Every recovery rebuilt ecological complexity on new foundations, producing new forms of biological organization that enriched the total evolutionary tree of life. This does not make the extinctions good. It does not diminish the tragedy of what was lost, the magnificent, irreplaceable 250-million-year-old world of the Late Permian and the extraordinary organisms that inhabited it. The Gorgonopsians are gone. The Pariasaurs are gone. The specific community of reef-building organisms that built the Permian reefs is gone. They are not coming back. Their loss is permanent, and permanent loss, even at geological timescales, is a genuine tragedy. But the recovery, the astonishing, creative, patient, relentless recovery of life, that is also real. And it tells us something about the nature of life on this planet that goes beyond the specific story of the Permian. Life as a process, as a phenomenon, as the expression of the particular physical and chemical properties of carbon-based chemistry operating in liquid water under the energy input of a medium-sized star, life is extraordinarily robust. Not any particular form of life, not any particular species or ecosystem. Those are fragile, irreplaceable, subject to permanent loss. But life as a process, as a capacity to organize matter into self-replicating, energy-processing, evolving complexity, that capacity has proven itself capable of surviving everything this planet has thrown at it. Asteroid impacts, massive volcanism, glaciations that covered much of the planet in ice, catastrophic changes in ocean chemistry and atmospheric composition. Life has endured all of it. It has been beaten back, reduced, devastated, but it has never been eliminated. It has always found its way back. The late Permian world stands as one of the greatest expressions of what life can build when given time and stability and the right conditions. The end Permian extinction stands as the most powerful demonstration of what it takes to destroy what life has built. And the long, slow, patient Triassic recovery stands as the most powerful demonstration of what life can do when given time and the opportunity to rebuild. These are not abstract lessons. They are not ancient history irrelevant to the present. They are facts about the living world, about our living world, the only world we have that deserve to be carried in mind when we think about the relationship between geological and biological processes, about the fragility and resilience of complex ecosystems, about the timescales on which living systems operate and the timescales on which they can be disrupted. As we come to the end of our journey through this ancient world, let us return one final time to the late Permian itself. Let us stand one last time on the ancient landscape of Pangea, in that world of extraordinary biological richness and ecological sophistication that the long Permian had built. It is early morning in the wet season, somewhere in the transitional zone between the coastal forest and the arid interior. The air is cool and damp, laden with the smell of wet soil and growing plants. The sky is pale in the east, grading through pink and orange to a deep blue overhead, unmarked by any high cloud. A light mist lies in the low places, in the valley bottoms and along the margins of the river, softening the outlines of the vegetation. The Dicynodonts are moving. Large group of them, perhaps 50 animals, a mix of sizes, their bodies massive and deliberate in the thin morning light, is crossing the open ground between a stand of seed ferns and the river bank, moving with the steady, unhurried purpose of large herbivores going to water. Their footfalls are heavy and rhythmic, and the sound of them carries in the still morning air. Their beaked mouths are open slightly, testing the air, and small clouds of condensation rise from their nostrils in the cool of the dawn. Overhead, something that is not quite a bird, for birds do not yet exist, moves silently on broad, leathery wings. It is one of the earliest precursors of the pterosaur lineage, or perhaps some other flying form, its body small and its wings large relative to its body, riding the thermals that are just beginning to form as the rising sun warms the rock surfaces and creates the upward air currents that aerial life depends on. It circles once over the moving herd below, observing something or nothing, and then angles away on a long glide toward the river. Near the river, at the boundary between the open ground and the thick vegetation of the river margin, a Gorgonopsian lies stretched in the growing warmth of the early sun. It is a large animal, an adult in its prime, its flank rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. It is not sleeping exactly, its eyes are open, tracking the movement of the Dicynodont herd at the periphery of its field of view, but it is in the relaxed, watchful stillness of a predator that has eaten recently and has no immediate need to hunt. Its sabers, enormous and precisely curved, catch the morning light and gleam dully. It is an animal of extraordinary physical power and ecological significance, a creature that embodies the peak of 290 million years of synapsid evolution, a predator without equal on the land surfaces of the late Permian world. In the river, a large temnospondyl lies just below the surface, its broad, flat head barely breaking the water, its eyes patient and its body as still as a log. It has been in this position for hours, waiting. Sooner or later, something will come to the water's edge. Something always does. The seed ferns along the bank are lush and heavy with fronds, their stems dark with moisture, their fronds catching the first direct light of the morning and holding it in 1,000 shades of green. Insects move among them, not the insects of the modern world, but recognizable as insects nonetheless. The fundamental body plan already ancient by the Permian, refined and specialized over hundreds of millions of years of evolution into the bewildering diversity of forms that crawl and fly and burrow through every available space in the late Permian ecosystem. Somewhere nearby, hidden in the root tangle at the base of a fallen seed fern trunk, something small and quick and mammal adjacent is going about its morning business. It is a small therapsid, one of the little noticed, less spectacular members of a lineage that the future belongs to, though neither it nor anything else in this world knows that. It is warm, relatively. It is active precisely when many of its larger, less metabolically elevated companions are still sluggish from the night's cool. It is quick and alert and flexible in its habits, and these qualities that seem, in the context of the magnificent late Permian world, like the modest traits of an unremarkable creature, are the qualities that will carry its descendants through the worst catastrophe in the history of life and into the long future that awaits on the other side. This world, this extraordinary, ancient, intricate, beautiful, merciless, productive, and profoundly alive world existed. It was real. It occupied this planet for tens of millions of years with as much full-blooded, sun-warmed, rain-soaked reality as any world has ever had. The creatures that moved through it were not abstractions. They were living animals with their individual lives and their individual deaths, their hunger and their satiety, their fear and their confidence, their brief moments of morning warmth in the early light of a Pangean dawn. They are gone now. The Gorgonopsians and the Dicynodonts and the Dinosaurs and the ancient reefs of Panthalassa are gone, as completely and as finally as anything can be gone. The particular community of life that the late Permian assembled over those tens of millions of years of ecological development will never exist again in exactly that form. What was lost in the end Permian extinction was lost forever, and the weight of that loss across the billions of organisms that died and the hundreds of thousands of species that vanished is beyond calculation. But the story did not end. That is the other truth, the companion truth that exists alongside the truth of the loss. The story continued. Life found a way. The small survivors carried forward, in their genes and in the ecological relationships they had preserved through the catastrophe, the biological potential that had been concentrated and refined over the entire history of life on this planet. And from that potential, from those survivors, from that remnant of biological richness that persisted through the most terrible of fires, from all of that, the world that we know today eventually emerged. Every mammal alive, every whale in the ocean, and every bat in the evening sky, and every elephant on the plain, and every human being who has ever looked at the stars and wondered about their origins, carries within them the legacy of the late Permian survivors. The therapsid synapsids that endured the end Permian extinction are our ancestors, in the most literal and traceable biological sense. Their survival was our beginning. And the world they built, the world that the great dying destroyed, the world whose memory is preserved in the ancient rocks of the Karoo and the Ural region and the basins of China, that world is a part of our deep history, as real and as consequential as anything in the more recent chapters of our ancestral story. The Permian world is gone, but we are here because of it. And because of it, we have the capacity to look back across the vast distance of geological time, to read the story written in ancient rocks and ancient bones, to imagine the late Permian in its fullness and its beauty and its terrible fragility, to understand in a way that no other species ever has the long story of life on this planet and our own place within it. This is the legacy of the late Permian. This is the gift that those ancient, extinct, magnificent, irreplaceable creatures left behind, not intentionally, not by design, but through the blind, patient, relentless process of biological history. They lived, they were extraordinary, they were lost, and out of their loss we eventually came to be. That is the story of the Permian. That is the story of the world before the end, and it is in the deepest sense the beginning of our own. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment below letting us know where you are watching from and what time it is there. We love hearing from our viewers around the world. And if you found this journey through deep time as extraordinary as we did in making it, please subscribe to the channel so you do not miss our future explorations of Earth's most remarkable chapters. The story of life on this planet is vast and endlessly fascinating, and we are only just beginning.